People, good morning and welcome. We're going to start the session. We had a very hard lesson yesterday in timekeeping. We then realized that if we're not going to be strict on timekeeping, we're not going to get through the program, and then we're not going to be able to finalize and give everybody the opportunity to participate in the Congress as we would have wanted to. We are on the last day of this session. And we're going to this morning deal with the session around gender and processes around that and the speakers that's going to participate. We do have 2 withdrawals on the program in itself, so the program may move up a little bit earlier in terms of the session. We are going to start now, like I said, with the issue around the track on gender and work. According to the program, there'll be a body break, but we're going to skip that body break because the 2 speakers after the body break has withdrawn. So we're going to just move up and bring tea a little bit earlier, after which we're going to have the panel discussion on the freedom of association, and then we're going to have the closing session as well. We do understand that there's some of you that are that is traveling back to your places of residence today. So we also want to give you some time to travel safely. So we're going to just adjust the program a little bit on that. Let me also welcome those people that is it's virtual and that is online for this session as well. Welcome to you. Our chairperson for this session is Mavis, the executive secretary of SACTA. We met her in the opening ceremony as well, in the opening session. She's going to chair this session for us. And Mavis, if you may come online, then I can hand over to you. And then we can start from there. All right.
Thank you very much for that. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session of our Congress, in which we have been discussing challenges facing employment relations, labor law, and social protection to reduce poverty, inequality, and unemployment in Africa in the wake of a global pandemic from Sunday. And we are now on the last day and on track 4 of our program. This morning, we will look at a number of issues, and we have quite a number of knowledgeable speakers that will be talking to us this morning. And we will run the program up to 11 o'clock, where then we will get into other issues. As it's been mentioned, we may skip break. So from 9 to 10, we'll be discussing the great COVID-19 gender divide, and the presenters are Tembi and Natalie. We would then go on to comparative studies of the impact of COVID-19 on employment for women in African countries and labor laws response to COVID-19. And then we'll move on to gender inequalities, discrimination in South Africa, moving forward or back. And then we would then followed by a discussion on working from home, what it means for the work-life balance of women in South Africa, consequences for the hand that rocks the cradle. And I will keep on introducing the presenters as we get to that. And as we begin and start the session on the great COVID-19 gender divide, I just would like to introduce the presenters, who are Tembi and Natalie. Tembi is the joint CEO of Global Business Solutions and a leading human resources consultant on BBEE and employment equity. She holds a degree in social science, as well as a postgraduate diploma in labor law. In 2016, she was appointed a commissioner representing Business and Employment Equity Commission. And Natalie has more than 12 years of experience in talent management, having run her own recruitment business and headed up the staffing professional body, APSO, from 2007 to 2014, including representing Africa on the World Employment Board. With that, I would want to welcome Tembi and Natalie to now start their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mavis, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session. And we thank you very much for allowing us to share a bit in terms of this very important topic. I am with Natalie, so I will be doing my introduction just a little bit, then I will hand over to Natalie to take us through. We're quite excited to really look into this topic of the great COVID-19 gender divide. And I think, as we know, that all of the that organizations and countries have been grappling with the gender equity, diversity, and inclusion. And as if that was not enough, as we know that we have been struggling, the COVID-19 has also just added its bit in terms of this great gender divide. What we have done in our paper is we looked through surveys that have been conducted all over the world, and we also did our own survey, which really just came to almost the same conclusion. So what we have also just realized is that, you know, working women have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And I think it's no surprise that we have all seen this, that a lot more women have lost jobs, a number of jobs compared to men. And our studies show us this, that at least 20% of women lost their jobs compared to about 9% of men in February 2020. And this really has impacted many women, obviously, as we've seen that, you know, they have an additional burden, which is caused by all the disruptions in terms of education, childcare, illnesses that, you know, they've had to take care of their families. And what we've also realized is that in our research, we've realized that most women who are traditionally employed in the sectors such as your hospitality, travel, tourism, they've been most affected by COVID-19. That obviously has impacted in terms of the employment relations, and that women generally have seen themselves being the ones who are you know, affected and having to leave their work because of, you know, they are the ones that are most affected and by inequalities in the workplace. And in fact, what we've seen as well in terms of our studies is that in the healthcare you know, sector, just looking at the pay equity as well, that at least 28% of women are paid less, you know, on average compared to their men counterpart. And this obviously, as we have seen, we've realized that women have been really, really affected by COVID-19. And, you know, globally, the research has also that, you know, when it comes to unpaid work, women have also remained, you know, being the ones who are affected generally because they're having to do the sort of unpaid work, especially in the household. But what was interesting as well in our studies is that in some countries, other than, you know, the African traditional sort of countries, we have seen also men taking up, you know, their space in society and helping. But I think from a traditional point of view in the African countries, we see the stereotypes continue to affect women, especially in the workplaces. And so next, you can move the slide, please, for me. Yeah, so we've also looked at the societal challenges that have affected women. So obviously, as we've seen that, you know, despite all these changes in the 21st century, the traditional stereotypes in our communities continue to dominate the decisions that are made, you know, in the workplace. And we've seen also companies that have done, you know, operational requirements, retrenchments, that the motherhood penalty sort of affects most of our women, that when it comes to, you know, looking at retrenchments, women are the first to be looked at, as opposed to looking at, you know, also just from what we have seen that, you know, at least 47% of mothers, they have lost their jobs permanently, or they've had to quit their jobs, you know, because of of this pandemic. And so what we also have looked at is the reports that have, even within our own customers and clients that we deal with, that reports that are coming up in terms of women experiencing a huge gender violence. And this also came out very much when looking at statistics, women that reported cases of gender-based violence. In fact, our own country in South Africa, they have reported at least 12,000 cases of women that have reported gender-based violence because being at home, they found themselves being affected, mainly, being physically abused and mentally abused. And then again, having said that, we've seen that in a number of countries, even with the ILO Convention 190, there's been measures that have been put to try and eliminate this harassment in the workplace, eliminate violence. But I think with COVID-19, we've seen all of those gains that we're experiencing being an improvement, that those gains are really just eliminated by the gender-based violence as well as the COVID-19 impact. So Nats, you can take over and just continuing with the presentation.
Thanks, Thembi. Yeah, absolutely. And it's our own study was interesting in that even though many of the people that we surveyed are in HR and related roles, many of the women are also in senior roles within their businesses who have been exceptionally busy as a result of COVID and the complexities of managing workforces during these times. It was quite disheartening, I think, to see that nearly half responded that they'd seen very little change at home. One even anecdotally commented that only one of them was working from home, it seems, in inverted commas, with less than 20% reporting a material difference in the sharing of responsibilities around childcare. And as we know, homeschooling for many during extended periods of time with the continued rotational cycles at schools. If we move on, we also realize that unfortunately there are still systemic challenges, as Thembi points out. So there is continued pay disparity, which we see globally. We have pay equity legislation in many countries around the world, including within South Africa in the within the confines of the Employment Equity Act, and particularly speaking around equal pay for work of equal value. But sadly, we still see women on average earning less than their counterparts. And there are numerous reasons for this, some of which I think are ingrained in the way in which we manage things. The practice of offering salaries as a benchmark off of what you previously earned means that historical inequity continues into the future. And we know that any periods of sabbatical, and we suspect, of course, post-COVID-19, with, as we've seen, most of the choices around families of who was going to stay home and take the additional responsibilities for childcare, etc., fell on women. We anticipate that those sabbatical periods will also unfairly and negatively impact future earnings, as it will have kind of stalled their salaries at a point in time, which wouldn't necessarily happen with male counterparts. This meme, and as a working mom with small kids myself, I relate, and I think many in the audience probably will too, is that we have this, I think, very unfair and unrealistic expectation that women should work as if they don't have any children. So they should be working and burning the midnight hours. And then contrary, you also are expected to be raising children as if you don't work, and that those feelings of guilt, of buying the cupcakes and sending them to school for birthday instead of baking them yourself, or feeling the pressure to say no to a late meeting because others are, fine to meet at 6 o'clock. And this is creating significant additional stresses on women in trying to cope with all of these things simultaneously. We have, of course, within our own space, but I think even in the global papers that we used as a part of our research, is that women, especially those with younger children, continue to report being overlooked for promotion and roles that require additional responsibilities, as there is this continued belief that somehow that will interfere with their ability to perform. What I think is helpful and was very encouraging from our survey is that the majority of respondents had said that their companies had put in place wellness programs, which included support for stress and mental wellness, which I think is critical as a tool for helping particularly women to navigate these very uncertain times and to manage all the additional stresses that they have. And then I think finally, in summing up, it's really going to be, I think COVID has put a spotlight on many areas of how we work and how we live, and this notion of balance, I think, is probably outdated. It's more like work-life integration, which needs to be found. But we hope that the gender divide, which has been highlighted, could be used positively to recognize how we can change things systemically for the future. So some of those around the shift in working, we talk, I was listening to a talk last week, which is challenging. Should we be talking about the new normal or rather the never normal? And I think that's probably more realistic, as I doubt that we're going to ever go back to where we were before, is to say, how do we find the best of both that helps women to, particularly, but of course all workers, to get the most out of what they need. And one of those which we believe could play a significant role is embracing what is known as results-only work environments, or ROE. This works particularly well, I think, for individuals who are working remotely or in hybrid circumstances, which shifts away this notion of time, but rather focuses on output. So what is expected to be performed? When is it supposed to be delivered by? And that then allows the freedom for individual circumstances to be catered for. So if that means that, you know, I as a working mom need to work a bit later in the evening after my kids have gone to bed, so that during the day when they're at home, I can support their schoolwork, that's a choice that I can make based on my own circumstances, and yet I can still be recognized as performing the work that I've been employed to deliver. Equally, I guess, stereotypical gender roles, and I think each of us has a role to play in this, you know, just from how we are raising our children, the notion of, you know, boys' toys and girls' toys, even all of these sorts of things in society will help us to create parity in this, in the belief that household chores, childcare, etc., is not a mom's job or a mom's prerogative. It's a parent's job, one that could be shared. And again, I guess that then speaks to also empowering young women, and as they grow into the workplace, to be more confident about saying no. I think we often very quick to say yes, and as a result, we don't set boundaries and we create this additional burden for ourselves very often. Temi, I don't know if there's anything you want to add in before we move on to the last three areas.
Nat, yeah, and I 100% agree with you that in terms of empowering women, that we need to encourage women to be able to say no. I think the issues that have been raised by some of my clients is, you know, especially women who have been on maternity leave, where they come back and they're limited in terms of their promotions. And these issues, they still continue. So we need to continue to raise awareness in terms of identifying these barriers that affect mainly women, not to say that men are not affected in the workplace with regards to some of these issues. But also I think as we are moving towards this new normal, that new policies need to come up for organizations that will encourage hybrid, you know, work and working environment, you know, to allow those women and also their partners to be able to work in an environment where it's inclusive. And I think just from that perspective of really just creating awareness as well in terms of eliminating, you know, these the harassment in the workplace, because most of the time we find as well women they're finding themselves, you know, being fearful because they you know, in terms of saying no because of the harassment that they experience from bullying as well, you know, so you end up then having more and more women getting, you know, sort of discriminated in the workplace. So that's what I think we need to be looking at and encouraging that. Thanks.
Thanks, Thembi. And then I think what's really exciting is to see that some countries, and including some companies within the South African context, are starting to take a more proactive responsibility to establishing boundaries. Because again, it's all very well for an individual or a group of individuals to say no, but as Thembi points out, if you're in the minority of saying no, the risk of harassment and bullying is great. Whereas if organizations seek to create environments which support that. In France, for example, we know that there is legislation which restricts when and how emails related to work can be sent out. We don't have such legislation, but we are seeing companies starting to think around how they deal with out of hours digital detox. Many of us, of course, have got our phones and our emails, and so there's this constant barrage and the feeling of guilt and responsibility if an email comes in that you don't respond immediately. So interesting to see some companies who are setting, for example, on their servers, that the server will block emails from, say, 6 o'clock at night or 7 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock the next morning. So should I be a night owl wishing to send emails at 2 in the morning, that's all fine and well. They'll go, they get to the server, but they don't get released until the agreed time in the morning, so that it doesn't place that additional pressure on the recipient to feel obligated to respond at whatever time that comes in. And I think that speaks to managing remote working, hybrid working, particularly where we are seeing global teams engaging, working across time zones. So the idea of how we can work asynchronously in a way that allows us to manage our own circumstances as far as possible, to balance our responsibilities, but also without creating this extension of the working day. It was also quite telling, I think, and certainly most of us, I think, can experience that and attest to it, is that working from home under COVID has actually extended the time we're working. So we've lost the commutes, but we've extended our days. And many of us are reporting, especially in the survey, it was nearly 60% reporting far busier than they've ever been before. And so this, of course, creates even more of a burden. MTN leading the way. Some of you might have seen the article a couple of weeks ago. They've actually now introduced for all of their staff members an additional 5 days of leave. And it's what they call digital detox leave. So when you take it, they literally disconnect you from the server so that you are forced not to respond to anything, because they recognize that that pressure exists, whether we are told to be on holiday or sick or whatever, that there is still that temptation. So they literally switch you off for 5 days in the hope of helping to create a little bit more balance. Of course, pay transparency continues to be a real issue. And in addition to, of course, remuneration policies, etc., we need to review HR practices such as, during recruitment, not being transparent around the salaries, so that individuals are able to know where they should be negotiating from, and not to be unfairly prejudiced by previous pay inequality which they carry forward. And included in that, interestingly, we know that semantics and the choice of words in how we advertise roles, how we set up competencies, and how we assess those competencies do feed into implicit bias and the continuation of gender bias. So those are the kinds of things that on a kind of a substantive level, which I think need to be looked at to help drive the reduction of barriers in the workplace, particularly for designated groups and particularly for women, and for us to be conscious about that going forward. So I'll hand over to Thembi now to close out for us. Thanks, Thames.
Thank you, Nats. Yeah, so I think for us really in this paper was, to look at, what are the issues with regards to COVID and how it's impacted the gender stereotypes and the gender divide, how organizations and countries can actually really take some of these suggestions to really eliminate this gender divide and encourage more inclusion in the workplace in terms of gender equality. And I do that, as organizations, we need to have deliberate measures put in place to ensure that we create inclusion and acknowledge, of course, that, this COVID-19 is a challenge and it will continue to challenge us as organizations. And we need to be conscious of it, and we need to be deliberate on what measures are we putting together to ensure that everyone feels the sense of equality and the sense of respect and dignity. I think also it's within ourselves to look at ourselves and say, what are we doing? How are we contributing towards gender inequalities in the workplace? And we're saying gender inequalities, not necessarily to say only women, but I think generally we all know that women are mainly impacted, and statistics and the surveys have showed us that we continue to see women being impacted by the societal roles, by the traditional roles, by the stereotypes, and of course now with this COVID-19. So, and I think as we continue to grapple on this, we need to also leverage on the legislations that are being promoted by different countries. In South Africa, we've got our own legislation that promotes equality for women, and we've got the gender commission in South Africa that promotes the gender equality. And in terms of our own sort of participation on the ILO 190 convention, which is all about promoting the elimination of violence and harassment and bullying in the workplace. I think we need to use these opportunities where we can promote more equality and inclusion in the workplace with regards to females. And thank you very much for allowing us to share our paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Thembi and Natalie, for that rich and quite informative presentation. We've noted women have been greatly affected. More women have lost their jobs, 20% systemic challenges with pay disparities, which has placed burden on the education and care of the families of these women, and that women are paid less on average compared to their male counterparts. And we still see gender stereotypes that continue to affect women in the workplaces, and also increased gender violence. All these issues affect employment relations. And we also note that there are also positives, with some companies having introduced wellness and tools for stress management for women, as well as recommendation that workplaces must create awareness for women to deal with harassment in the workplace and establish boundaries, and how to manage remote working and create a balance. I would ask all of you to hold on to your questions, as we will have a discussion at the end. And just to manage time, we will then move on to the second presenter, which is Bathandwa, who will talk to us about comparative studies of the impact of COVID-19 on employment for women in African countries and labor law's response to COVID-19. Bathandwa is an aspiring academic with a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Fort Hare and Master of Law in Dispute Resolution from the University of Cape Town. Her areas of research and interest are gender equality in the workplace. I'll hand over now to Bathandwa to carry on with your presentation. Thank you.
Morning, Bathandwa, are you there?
Yes, I see Bathandwa online. Have you unmuted from your end? Bathandwa, can you unmute yourself, please? It looks like Bathandwa is challenged, and perhaps in that regard, we can move on to the next presenter, for the sake of time. And whenever Batanda is ready, then we would give them an opportunity. We would now move on to gender inequalities, discrimination in South Africa. Are we moving forward or back? And this will be presented by Shailene. Shailene Audit. Shailene holds a master's degree in labor law from the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University and a postgraduate diploma in labor law. She is currently the General Secretary of the General Public Service Sector Bargaining Council and an exco member of International Labor and Employment Relations Association and the chairperson of the National Association of Bargaining Councils in South Africa. Shailene, you may go on with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chairperson. Thank you for that introduction. Our paper seeks to address the question of whether South Africa, through its progressive gender legislation, is moving forward in addressing past and current gender inequalities in the workplace. The presentation will cover a brief historical overview of past gender practices. We will look at legislative frameworks that have been enacted to promote gender inequality or equality rather in South Africa. We will also provide a view on the rate of women participation in the economy and provide some statistics on the gender wage gap. Looking at the historical background, it is clear that the apartheid laws in South Africa entrenched discrimination, not only across race groups, but also ensured that these laws held women in a subordinated position. The laws of the day also misused cultural norms to render women to second-class citizens. This legacy of patriarchism and discrimination can still be found today in communities. The laws may have changed, but the experience of women and girls are still entrenched in discrimination. As a means to undo the legacy of the past discrimination, legislative framework in the form of the Constitution and relevant legislation, particularly the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, PEPUDA, the Employment Equity Act, and the Labor Relations Act were amongst others promulgated as an attempt to address these past discriminations. To this end, the Employment Equity Act is considered one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in Africa. This legislation requires employers to take steps to promote equal opportunity in the workplace by eliminating unfair discrimination against employees on the grounds of gender. The Act seeks to right the wrongs of the past and promote a culture of equal opportunity and fair treatment. We should also note that the Labor Relations Act also requires that the conditions of employment be a fair and transparent one by promoting and prohibiting unfair discrimination, either through a direct or an indirect basis. Coming to the question and more to the research that was considered in developing this paper, the question of has the legislation worked and what are the stats saying? What is the rate of participation of women in the economy? And has the workplace reformed in the past 27 years? And has these pieces of legislations had the desired effect in terms of progressing gender equality? What we found, unfortunately, is that despite women making up just over half of the population, and South African women having obtained more bachelor's degrees than men, women still remain relatively underrepresented in the workplace. According to Statistics South Africa, the Q2 report of 2018, only 32% of managers in South Africa are women. This accounts for women occupying only 1 in every 3 posts, or every 1 in 3 managerial posts. The report also reflects that women mainly dominated in the domestic sector, the clerical sector, and the technician occupations, with men occupying the rest. We should note that the situation has not improved. The Stats South Africa Q2 2020 report reflects that women occupying managerial posts has actually dropped since 2018 by a further 1% to 31%, indicating a backward trend. Interestingly, the report reflects that the public sector in South Africa is doing marginally better in terms of female representation in management posts. This could be due, and we attested to, stricter monitoring and enforcement of employment equity in the public sector, as well as the effective use of the gender machinery. Although, however, that the private sector or the public service is doing marginally better than the public sector, women still only occupy 39.3% of managerial posts in the public service. Coming to the gender pay gap, and it should be noted that the gender pay gap remains a major stumbling block in South Africa in achieving the equality, gender equality in the workplace. The previous speaker, the first two speakers, dealt extensively on the gender wage gap. So I'm going to just breeze through this part of the presentation so that we get into the actual recommendations and challenges. As we know, the gender pay gap is the difference between the wages that men are paid for the same positions that women may be occupying for a substantially a lesser value in terms of payment. The United Nations commissioned a report in 2014 on the distributional changes in the gender wage gap in the post-apartheid South Africa. This graph shows that the gap could not be addressed in the 20 years within which this report was looked at, notwithstanding the laws and the policies that were put in place to address these shortfalls. More recently, the ILO also commissioned a report in 2017, where the median gap 8.8%. As alluded already, South Africa does have mechanisms in place to curb the gap. The Constitution, PEPUDA, the EEA, all of these processes seeks, or legislation seeks, to address the pay discrimination. More recently, through the King Forward report on good governance, which requires companies and boards to approve reports on the implementation of its remuneration policies. These processes were brought in place to try and address, particularly in the private sector, the ever-growing disparities, particularly on the wage gap. Coming to recommendations, and in looking at what is the way forward in terms of trying to address the disparities that we find, it is recommended that companies discuss equal gender pay, including pay audits, particularly during the collective bargaining processes. However, the effectiveness of these measures depends on the development of collective bargaining in particular sectors. It should be noted that the more developed the collective bargaining structures, the more unionized the workforce, the easier it will be to implement these measures. It may well also be the reason why in South Africa, the public sector outranks the private sector in respect of addressing gender appointments and pay parity. It's just the high level of collective bargaining and engagements within this sector being the public service. Coming to really the conclusion, globally, the World Economic Forum estimates that it may take another 202 years before the gender economic pay gap is closed. Embedded in this is the gender wage gap. South Africa has made great strides towards addressing gender inequality. However, we found that purposeful momentum towards this goal has significantly declined. So as much as we have all of these wonderful pieces of legislation and an extremely progressive constitution, we are not seeing this reciprocate into actual benefits for women in the workplace. So what this paper seeks to do is it seeks to refocus the debate and motivate action within South Africa to take the process of gender equality forward and not backward. Chair, women cannot wait another 202 years for equality. It needs to start today, if not yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Charlene, for that, sharing your paper with us, addressing gender inequalities, discrimination in South Africa, and whether we are moving forward or back. I will now call upon Batandwa to come on and present on comparative studies of the impact of COVID-19 on employment for women in African countries and labor law's response to COVID-19. Batandwa would have come in before Charlene, but if you are ready, Batandwa, may you please go on?
I'm not presenting.
Batandwa, are you ready? Okay, are you ready, Batandwa, or should we move on to the next presenter? It looks like Batandwa is challenged with the PC mic. So it looks like Batandwa's PC mic is giving them challenges. So we will move on to the next presenter. The presentation is working from home, what it means for the work-life balance for women in South Africa. And this will be presented by Arabo. Arabo is the project and engagement manager at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies and has a Master's of Commerce and Economics degree from the University of the Witwatersrand. May you go on, Arabo?
Hi, sorry, it will be presented by Fikile.
Okay, thank you very much. If Fikile is present, may you go on? Fikile is the professor, is Professor Edward Webster's research assistant on the Future of Work project at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at WITS, and Frederick Ebert Stiftung in South Africa. She's currently pursuing a PhD in industrial sociology at the University of WITS. May you please go on, Fikile? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to be part of this discussion as we continue to think through the reality, the impact and implications of the global pandemic on employment relations broadly and in the global South. So we've changed the title of our paper slightly to Working Alone in South Africa, a tale of increased precarity and deepened inequality. It has been over a year since COVID has infiltrated our society. The world of work and how business is being conducted has been severely impacted and altered. While society and business is adapting to this new normal, it is of interest to note that scholars have also begun to theorize how labor has been affected in these environments. For those working in the informal economy, particularly the 5-week lockdown between March and April 2020, for instance, was a period of unprecedented insecurity and hunger, without work, income, or benefits on the one hand. On the other, the minority, professional, and middle classes with plenty of space to work and access to a computer, Wi-Fi, and reliable electricity, working from home was less disruptive. While home working or home-based work is not a new phenomenon, the global pandemic and the lockdown restrictions have relocated previously office-based workers to working remotely. Hence, at no time in history have we had such a large and heterogeneous group of workers being home-based. In terms of gender, women workers represent over half of all home-based workers. This strongly correlates with the fact that prevailing gender roles result in women bearing the larger share of the care burden, coupled with other norms that restrict their ability to work outside of the home. Given the historical prevalence of homework, in our paper, we reflect on why this recent shift to homework is receiving increased attention. In so doing, we discuss the South African context. Instead of being the great leveler, as pandemics have been throughout history, the coronavirus has revealed and deepened South Africans' multiple intersecting inequality along the lines of race, gender, wealth and income, spatially and in access to digital connectivity. Unskilled workers and individuals earning low wages have often worked from home since the pre-apartheid era. These workers were typically Black and mostly female. Hence, we argue that the ability to work from home and the profile of the new home worker, predominantly white, higher skilled and high wage earners, possessing the space and access to the infrastructure that enables homework, has highlighted homework in a manner that will deepen some of these pre-existing inequalities. In this paper, we discuss the shift from homework in South Africa through an inequality lens. I will speak on three main sections that our paper highlights. Firstly, we looked at the history and development of homework, focusing on the transition to factory work and then the re-emergence of homework in the age of globalization and digitalization. In pre-industrial times, work happened in households. Individuals owned the materials and means of production, or a third party brought the materials and collected and sold the final goods. The rise of the factory did not dispense with working from home, as innovations such as sewing machines increased working from home opportunities and expanded the share of women employed. Unemployed and unskilled Black workers excluded from the higher wage paying primary labor market. Many were forced to work from home. Men cobblers, furniture makers, and women sewing garments, owning spaza shops and shebeens. The rising use of computer and ICT led to the global supply chain. Now people working from home are not classified as self-employed as they interface with an intermediary. While there is various benefits given to working from home, i.e. greater access to the labor markets for participants such as women, those with caring responsibilities for people with disabilities, some workers enjoy greater autonomy, flexibility, and control over their tasks. Lower transport costs as the cost of commuting reduces for those who can work from home. The costs and benefits depend on your gender, the nature of your job, and your specific occupational level. Secondly, to discuss worker well-being post-COVID-19, it is important to understand the impact of the pandemic on a selection of labor market outcomes. To do this, we drew on findings from the National Income Dynamics Study Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Survey, the NITSCRAM. This is a follow-up survey of a subsample of households in the fifth wave of a national longitudinal survey, the National Income Dynamics Study. The objective of the NITSCRAM study is to investigate the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19 as well as any government interventions on South African households. Finally, we undertook a short survey titled Working from Home, What It Means for Employees, Managers, and the Future of Work, to capture the experience of...
Hi, Fikile, you have 3 minutes to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, I'm almost done. We undertook a study on what it means for employees and workers to work from home to capture the experience of working from home under COVID-19. We conducted an online interview via Zoom with virtual customer services who work for tech giants in South Africa. What emerged from the interviews was that there is no freedom, instead increased monitoring and micromanagement. Home workers are also increasingly isolated as they lack meaningful access to colleagues. Distance makes it harder for workers to organize and collectively bargain. Increased demands for productivity and efficiency could raise worker stress levels. Tensions as work-life balance collapses. Workers requires reliable access to internet, which is costly in South Africa. Homework has increased precarity for some, as employers have transferred the risk and the cost to workers and gotten away with paying such workers less. Overall, the big question remains, what are the implications of working from home for the future of work? As we think through this question, what is apparent is that work has always and will always remain a fundamental feature of any society. whether the COVID-19 crisis continues or not. Homework could well become the next terrain of worker struggle. Impactful and meaningful provision has to be put in place, particularly for women who have to juggle care responsibilities while working from home, as well as those who do not have access to internet because of their location and social status. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fikile, for that eloquent presentation. We will now move on to consequences for the hand that rocks the cradle. It is going to be presented by Bristol Buys. And Bristol Buys is an Assistant Director of Strategic People Management at the Western Cape Education Department and a part-time lecturer at the University of Cape Town. He's a PhD candidate on commercial law at the University of Cape Town. His working title for his thesis is From Maternity to Parental Leave in the Best Interest of the Child and Recommendations for Law Reform in South Africa. Bristol was admitted to the following degrees: Social Science in Labor, Organizational Psychology and Human Resource Management, BCom Honors in Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and an LLM specialization in labor law. His passion lies in assessing the law in the context of the social sciences. Over to you, Bristol.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I think all of the speakers probably touched on what I'm going to speak about. So I will very quickly go through my presentation, and it is quite skinny as I am, as you'll see. But in any case, thank you also to the organizers. Next time, I just need a lapel mic because, as my chief director at the back will tell you, I just need a stage and a lapel mic, and I need to walk up and down. So if I move around, it's not Tourette's, it's just I need to move. But anyway, so why consequences for the hand that rocks the cradle? That comes from mom. So mom is a psychiatric nurse. She works 12 hours a day, and then she has to work overtime as well. So she comes home, and then mom still needs to bathe us. She needs to clean. She needs to do everything at home. And I asked mom one day, Mom, so when are you going to become the matron? Because you're brilliant at your job. And mom said, the minute that one lifts his ass up from the couch, that's when I will become a matron. So consequences for the hand that rocks the cradle comes from the title, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle Rules the World. And my mother definitely rocked that cradle. And that's the reason why I'm standing here. It's because of my mom. I couldn't do for her back then, but I'm dedicating my life's work, or the work that I will be doing in my life, because I'm only 32 now, to women and to mothers out there. Okay, so what I will do is I will go through a sensory assessment. If this was a lecture, I would obviously have asked you to feel a few things, but on that slide, I'm going to be a bit narcissistic and I'm going to tell you what you are feeling and what you should be feeling. So, and then just a historical overview very quickly. It's not going to be a history lesson. And then a deemed substantive provision. Then we'll go into what the actual consequences are for the hand that rocks the cradle. And lastly, I will do a very quick summary overview. Okay. So first up, the sensory assessment. I just want you to have a look at these pictures and then just what your innate feelings are towards these pictures. So most of these pictures that are up there are men that are basically juggling everything. So they are what we call multitasking. Now for you out there, I know that that is not natural. You feel it's not natural. No, that's not working. But when you see the mother doing it, it seems okay because she's sitting there, she's comfortable with the child and everything. I'm saying it's a law that is steering you and society to feel that way, that it's okay for mothers to do it, but it's not okay for fathers to do it. It's this whole thing of masculinity, or this thing that they hold men to a different astute than women. And for me, that's why that title, Consequences for the Hand That Rocks the Cradle, even though my mother's my hero, it's that very title that has also led to the oppression and subjugation. So looking at these pictures, I mean, even that one picture over there, it can only point you. Let me just see. Okay, pointer's not working. Oh. Okay, now that's not working for me. But anyway, the one picture over there, you see two men walking with a stroller, and then you see two females walking up there with a stroller. Which one is more natural? The two females walking with a stroller, because what are those two men talking about? But in any case, probably sport. Then after the sensory assessment, the historical overview. So in terms of work, remember back in the day, women could not work. Rather by World War I and World War II, we needed women to work because the men were out there fighting the war. And we can go into talking about the second sexism. Men weren't able to make the decision and men just had to go and work. But the point that I want to make there is, since 1930 to 1970, women have been entering the workplace. Then next, caregiving. Caregiving is obviously assigned to whom? The mother. And I mean, that was in my case also, mom did everything and the care work. And that is also because of societal norms and expectations of this thing that we call intensive mothering. Then also again, in terms of dismissals, remember back in the day, women could not fall pregnant, otherwise they would be dismissed. Even if we get to the point where a female is of the age where they could potentially fall pregnant, we would also dismiss them. That is what happened in the past. Then also the segregation, and the segregation is not just a historical overview, but it's a current thing as well. You still find that some occupations are, okay, this is the part where I want to move. But in any case, I'm not going to move, I'm going to stand still because the camera's on. So in terms of segregation, you still have the engineering that is an influx of men in engineering, and also in nursing. If you go into a nursing institution, you would find that there are more women there. The same with education. So why is that the case? Let's move on. So a deemed substantive provision, I'll explain to you exactly what I mean by a deemed substantive provision. Firstly, in my paper, I touch on the international instruments, and what I touch on basically is the ones from the United Nations, which is a bigger body, and then also the specialized body, the ILO. The two most important ones that I want to use from that is the CEDAW, so in terms of the United Nations, and then Convention 156, which is the workers and their family responsibilities, because that tells us it's important for men to also partake in care work so that we can have this sort of gender equality. Now, my main issue in terms of the consequences for the hand that rocks the cradle is this one, which is section 25 of the BCA. So section 25 of the BCA says that maternity leave is given to whom? It says an employee. Who's that employee? That employee can only be the mother, because the mother is able to give birth, conceive and give birth. So I'm not saying there's a problem entirely with section 25. Yes, women require protection during pregnancy. Otherwise they would have been dismissed. They also require protection for at least 6 to 8 weeks thereafter, according to medical research, to recover. But who decided that the remainder of that leave is for the woman to bond? That is where we start to create this primary and secondary caregivers. We create absent fathers, because a father that's absent at the beginning will be an absent father later on. Okay, so section 25 of the BCA, that is what I problematize. Then also, the complementary one that we've recently received, it's been coming on since 2018, but was ascended in 2020, is section 25A of the Labour Law Amendment Act. That is now what we used to call paternity leave, you know, the 3 days. So what we've done, or what the legislature have done, is we've extended that to 10 days. So I'm saying, well done. That is only 7 extra days that we are giving the other partner. It's also much more gender neutral, but that's a small step that we are taking. Small step in the right direction. I'm saying we should take a leap of faith and we should take it a step further. Then also just a difference for those who are not legally inclined or who's not lawyers. I'm not myself a lawyer either, but the difference between formal and substantive equality. Formal equality is basically just the assumption that we are all equal. But the approach that we have taken in South Africa is one of substantive equality. We are recognizing that everyone is not equal and there is these differences. So we need to manage those differences. And that's why I said section 25 of the BCA is a deemed substantive provision. It is not actually that substantive in nature because it still relegates women to the four corners of the home. Then what I also did in my paper is just a superficial interpretation of the Harkson versus Lane case. That is what we use in terms of the Constitutional Court to just look at fairness in terms of discrimination, to look at unfair discrimination. I'm not going to go into detail. It is in my paper. I want you to read my paper. So I'm going to leave it there. Okay, so what are those consequences? Just going to put them all there because I've just got 10 minutes. It's career progression. Why can't women progress in their careers? Because they need to look after the kids at home. Men can progress, so it is gendered. Then also, what is the role conflict? That role conflict is the multiple roles that women need to play. What is it? It's the worker. It is the intensive mothering that's expected from society. Career goals. So women tend to put their career goals aside when they start to get married, firstly, even worse when they become mothers. So the career goals become secondary, it becomes a distant memory. Then also role strain. So role strain is when we have this ideal role that we need to play versus the expected role. Then also in terms of role proliferation, now this is a study that a psychiatrist did of 16 of his female patients, and they were all medical doctors. What happened was this role proliferation is when you are trying to juggle balls of conflicting interests. Okay, so you have the worker, you have the I must be the perfect worker, I must be the perfect mother. And I think one of the speakers spoke to it. I think almost Charlene spoke to it, or Charlene spoke to it before, which was the balancing. And what happens is if you cannot balance, sometimes that ball is going to fall. And when that ball falls, what does it lead to? It leads to major depressive disorder and essentially to suicide. And that is what happened in the case of that psychiatrist's study. Also, conflict over the division of family labor, it causes marital stress or marital distress. That's what happens in terms of not being able to have this equal divide in terms of the gender. But overall, what steers this? This is the law. It is a law that's creating these consequences, but I also am very much safe in my speaking. I say it's unintended consequences because I don't want to be scratching on the legislature. I'm just saying that if they knew about these consequences, they would have decided differently. Okay, then in terms of the summary, it looks like I'm doing good for time because the chairperson didn't warn me yet. So in terms of the summary,
you have
I'm
1 minute.
Section 25. Oh, there's a warning coming. Okay, very quickly. Section 25 of the BCAA bears consequences. Those consequences leads to unfair discrimination in terms of Hodgson versus Lane. It's unfair discrimination not only for the mother, but also for the father and the child. And what I'm advocating is that we should stop looking at this gender divide. How we will get to that gender divide is by looking at the best interest of the child, which is Section 28(2) of the Constitution. Then I'm also saying the legislation has helped us for women to enter the workplace, but getting them to stay is another thing. So we need to start working on letting them stay in the workplace and not leave the job because of the child. What we also need to do is we need to demasculinize the workplace. And Charlene again spoke about that. Also, care work needs to be defeminized. We need to just normalize that. And then also, in order for it to be truly substantive, we need to move to parental leave, not what we call it in South Africa, but what the Nordic countries refer to in terms of parental leave. So that is a year for both parents to be at home, actively involved with the child, because that is going to create good child outcomes at the end of the day. Got an entire psychological theory on that as well. And then lastly, agency will be restored because we remove women's agency by relegating them to the home and the four corners of the home. And some homes are smaller than others. I mean, if you're in a mansion, then I don't mind being relegated to that home. And also agency is restored for the family. Then very lastly, Chairperson, I just want them to have a look at this picture because I think it summarizes my thesis actually. If you can't see well there at the back, it is basically 3 businesswomen and 3 businessmen that are running a race. But if you look at the women, they have washing that's hanging there in the race. They've got food that they're busy making. There's everything there, but the men has nothing there. So yeah, that is it from me. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bristol, for that passionate and pictorial presentation. I would like to give another chance to Batwanda on comparative studies of the impact of COVID-19 on employment for women in African countries and labor law response to COVID-19. Batwanda, if you are ready, you have one more last chance. Batwanda? If not, we will move on to the next presentation, the gender dynamic, the impact of COVID-19 and beyond. And it will be presented by Anisha Parker, who is the Employee Relations Specialist for the Foschini Retail Group in South Africa. She holds a BCom Law and LLB from the University of Cape Town. Over to you, Anisha.
Good morning, everybody. Before I start, I just want to say how grateful I am to be included in this conference. It's really been a fantastic learning experience. And hearing the insights from all the speakers who have participated, I just want to say a huge thank you on my part for making the time to attend this session. It's really been very humbling. So the paper that I'm presenting on examines the effect that COVID-19 has had from a gender perspective across various sectors and levels of employment, and also what is needed to redress these effects so that we do not experience further setbacks from a gender perspective. And also, is there room for the discussion that the adverse effects which have resulted, albeit indirectly from the pandemic,
Apologies. Apologies. Could you perhaps turn up your mic? It's very, very soft.
Anisha, may you turn up the volume on your mic a little bit and continue with the presentation, please?
Is that better?
Yes, I can hear you. Can everyone hear her loud and clear?
I'm going to take
Go
that
on, Anisha.
as yes. So as I was saying, the paper looks at whether or not there is room for the discussion that adverse effects which have resulted, albeit indirectly, from the pandemic can be mitigated by employers and other stakeholders. And the pandemic has affected the disparity between male and female gender on a large scale and is vastly changing just the overall landscape of the labor market. More than a year later, the effects of COVID-19 have resulted not only in significant job losses and business closures, but also had a disproportionate effect on the working life of a woman and has left somewhat of a shadow pandemic in its wake. So to begin with, I'm going to take you back to a session that was presented on Monday by our colleague from the ILO. And the ILO has done considerable research in terms of women's rights to work and how that is at the core of the COVID-19 recovery. And so even before the pandemic, and this is in the research, jobs with a high concentration of women are characterized by low wages, long working hours, limited opportunities for career advancement, and exposure to occupational health and safety risks. And when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, these trends put women workers at a greater risk of being laid off. And so what we've seen is a significant contraction in terms of the working hours and just a further deterioration in terms of the working conditions. So if we just take a step back and consider the labor market before COVID-19, you realize that women are already faced with pre-existing inequalities in the workplace. When you compare to your male counterparts, women generally earn less, women have fewer savings, and women are represented disproportionately in the informal economy. And we therefore tend to face more challenges and barriers in the workplace than our male counterparts. So in this, I'm referring to issues such as underrepresentation in the workplace, various forms of discrimination and related issues, pay disparity, and just achieving a work-life balance and juggling your job along with other roles, such as being a caregiver or the caretaker of a household. And when the COVID-19 pandemic came about in March 2020, all of these disproportionalities and
excuse me, Anisha.
complexities. Yes, ma'am.
May you kindly share your presentation again? Okay, move on.
Apologies. I was saying when the COVID-19 pandemic hit in March 2020, all of these types of disparities and challenges were accelerated. And women have had to endure a lot of these difficulties. And as a result, the risk is that all the progress that we've made in preceding decades are at a risk of being reversed and being undone. And the UN Women Organization has done quite a lot of research in terms of what the impact has been in terms of COVID-19 for women in the workplace. And according to a report that they've compiled, women are losing their livelihoods quicker due to the fact that they are exposed to economic sectors which have been harder hit by the pandemic. And in terms of this study, 58% of women are informally employed, and a whopping 60% of that number lost their income in the first month of the pandemic. So that is quite scary. And then if you also consider that at the same time, other sectors such as travel, retail, childcare, education, etc., which are very closely linked to enabling full-time work, have also suffered. And all this does is that it then compounds the already negative impact that working women are experiencing. And what this then translates to, and what you see across various sectors, is that there is a disproportionate effect on genders. So more women are losing their jobs, more women are faced with a decrease in earnings, and more women are faced with an overall decrease in paid working time, inevitably just resulting in the widening of an already existing gender divide. McKinsey has also done quite a lot of research in this respect, and what they estimate is that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic could easily set women back half a decade. The research relating to women in the workplace consistently finds that pre-COVID-19, women and men would exit the labor market at comparable rates, but taking into consideration the challenges that are presented by the COVID-19 crisis, as many as 2 million women are considering leaving the workforce. And if you find yourself in a labor market where women are feeling that they are forced to leave the workplace, essentially what you end up with many years later is fewer women in roles of leadership and far fewer women on track to become fewer leaders. And ultimately, all the progress that we would have seen in recent years could be erased. So amidst all this panic and uncertainty that we are faced with, we need to ask ourselves, where to from here? What are the opportunities for support and recovery efforts? And how do we curb this negative impact? And according to the IMF, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic are so devastating that it threatens to undo progress which have been made by women in at least the last 30 years. And so it is imperative that recovery efforts are made by stakeholders. The effects of COVID-19 will have a long-lasting impact if there aren't measures and efforts put in place now to curb that impact. Economic insecurity now will in all likelihood lead to future impacts on savings and pension funds. And for the poorer and more vulnerable communities of women, the impact will obviously be more severe. And we need to ask ourselves, what are the opportunities here? So what recovery efforts can be put in place now? And ultimately, what we need to see is stakeholders, which includes both government and employers, step up. We don't see these advances being made on a global level, then ultimately gains made by women in the working environment will be undone and regress. And this includes the need to recognize that inequalities already exist between male and female employees. And we need to look at putting in place measures to remedy these equalities. So for example, the adoption of flexible working arrangements or remote work, addressing the causes of stress and burnout, mental health issues, and well-being issues all related to the COVID pandemic. We need to see equal representation of women at all levels of employment and all levels of decision-making. We need to see gender-responsive policies, investment initiatives, and potentially even fiscal policies enacted with the intention of providing economic relief measures. So in closing, I'm going to leave you with a quote from the ILO, and they've said in their research that as a greater proportion of women's employment has been lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic, extraordinary policy efforts are needed to ensure that women return to the labor market with decent work opportunities. If priority is not given to this goal, there is a risk that women will be left behind in their recovery efforts, further exacerbating existing gender inequalities in terms of access to and quality of employment. Gender equality considerations need to be an intrinsic component of the design, development, implementation, and results of all programs and strategies, policies, laws, and regulations implemented as a response to a recovery from COVID-19. Ultimately, what we need to see is greater emphasis being placed on gender-responsive policies, which are transformative in order to create an equal and inclusive society for the future. And that's it from me. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Anisha, for that presentation. The next two presentations have been cancelled, and I think it's time for us now to move on to but if Batonda is still around, maybe we can give them another chance, or we move on to another discussion based on all the presentation that we've had this morning until 11 o'clock. There has been questions and comments on the chat box, which I think everyone has been following. And if people have questions, clarifications, we would ask you to raise your hands, and then we would request, the presenters to come in and have a last word before we close the discussion.
Mavis, good morning. I'm also going to assist you. I'm going to assist you from the floor. We've got people that has got their hands up in the physical room that's going to ask questions. So I'm going to ask those that would want to ask a question just to move to a mic, and then we will follow you from mic to mic in terms of the questions to be posed. So Mavis, we've got two questions here. If we can continue in the hall to hear those questions.
Yes, please, let's go on. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Luigi? All right, you can continue. You can ask the question. Maybe just remove the mask first. You are safe there. It's just that it's a bit difficult. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, all. Look, mine is not necessarily a question, but I think it's an input to all the papers that are presented on the issues of women. And I think academically, we are doing well in terms of dealing with issues of gender inequalities. But there are very serious salient points that we're not touching, both at professional and at academic level when we're addressing women issues, especially when we deal with the issues of interpretation of discrimination and unfair discrimination when it comes to the implementation of affirmative action. One, the reason why I'm saying that is that we tend not to look deeper into what this means in terms of competitive advantages of, well, how should I say it? Of African women or Black women, let me say it bluntly as it is, of Black women when we talk to issues of interpretation of you should not discriminate in terms of the color and so forth. Now, you might be looking at the implementation, especially in terms of employment, of employing Mapitso Mashele as a Black woman or African woman. And then, but there is one element that we are missing in doing that. It's the issue of the experience and also the academic qualifications, which also raises issues of competitive advantages and disadvantages. That's an input that we need to look at. Two, this also goes further to the issues of salary parities, women versus women. And every time we're talking about the issues of women, we tend to think that the problem is between male and female, women and men. No, there are also bigger problems in terms of women versus women in the workplace. You will never close that gap. And I think we need to, as we're doing this analysis and research, go further and deeper into also unpacking what consists of inequalities, because there are inequalities between women and women. There are those inequalities. So we need to move away of interpreting this in a very narrow kind of an approach. Lastly, Chair, in terms of, there's something that my learned friend there said in conclusion about the consequences. And one of the issues that I don't agree with him on is that one of the consequences is the pay, is the progression, because women cannot progress because of kids. No, that's not the issue. The issue that I also want you to look at as part of the consequences is that women are not progressing because they are not capacitated to do so. One, by the system; two, by the male counterparts who are their principals; three, by lack of confidence to do so, because we were seen to be belonging in the kitchen. And that is not applicable at the workplace. But unfortunately, those are the realities that we find ourselves facing as women in the workplace. So as we're doing this research, we really need to go into very soft issues around the progression of women, both at academic level, at professional level, because the other challenge is that even if you're given a place to be, but you're not capacitated and you fail. So we are set up for failure as women because we are not equally capacitated, and we entered the system not as at the same time with the male counterparts who were in the system.
Thank you very much for that presentation in 10 minutes. That was Virginia Mashele. For those people online that's not privileged to be here, that was Virginia that asked the question. I'm going to take the second question, Mavis. If you just introduce yourself just for the people online so that they also know who is asking the questions. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Chair. I am Jabulile Mabaso from SAPU. My colleague there just actually said a whole lot that I actually had in mind. Also, we need to, okay, it's not a question. We need to look at the dynamics that we have, tradition and cultural dynamics where empowerment is concerned. As much as we are empowering women into growth, Mbogoto, you must be this, you must be that. But are we doing the same for the men that are actually going to be led by these women? Because this is the problem we are facing. Men are not capacitated enough to take in that these women are going to be in leadership. This is all good in paper, but then when it comes to the reality, we really need to look strongly at that. Anisan said this pandemic is going to take women a decade back. Unfortunately, this is so true because it has set us back. But then what are we doing about it? Because there are certain things that we really need to look into, and not just on paper, actually practicing them. We are a very cultured country, actually a continent that is very cultured. I don't want to call it being bossy, but then the men being the dominators is inbred. This is going to take a while to actually get out of it. So now these are things that we need to look into. How do we also equally bring the men into this empowerment of women? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still have one more question in the room, which we're going to, there's two more questions in the room coming up.
Yes, thank you. I think we should go ahead and finish with all the questions in the room. Then we will move on to those that are on the virtual platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you, Chair. My name is Bonnie Marekwa from PopCro. I've listened to the speakers talking, but let me start with the one that mentioned the World Economic Forum when they were sitting and came up with an idea that to close the gender gap, wage gap, will take about 267 years. I think when you look into who is sitting in the World Economic Forum, when they are sitting, then you'll understand why it will take longer. Because we don't have many women in that platform. Yeah. So future and lives of women are being determined by someone without including them, including women, and deciding for women. So if we allow that, it will take those years for us to have the gender wage gap closed. But there are ways and means to close that gap or expedite, make sure that it is realized that we have it closed, the gender wage gap. if people are very serious, those who are in the main taking decisions, if they are serious in making sure that we achieve this, it will happen. But our problem is that world over, people will come up with plans, strategies. One of the speakers also mentioned that there are strategies or mechanisms in place, but our problem is in implementing and making sure that there's decisive decisions, decisive leadership taken in making sure that we realize and implement what we have resolved from platform to platform. The other part also is that when you check into the studies that have been conducted, about 68 countries are saying that when more funds or income is put in the hands of women, then there will be improvement in the sense of health, child nutrition, and education, because women are actually responsible and will know what to do with the money they receive. So it's not about just having the wage gap closed, but it's also to making sure that those who women are taking care of, the families are being able to also be able to benefit from the income that the mothers or the women in the house gets from wherever they are working. And then the other part is that one of the last speaker mentioned the issue of flexible time of work, but it differs. What is flexible work hours for a man can never be the same as flexible working hours for a woman. Currently, most will opt, because of the pandemic, will opt to work from home. But it's totally, nothing changes for a woman, because the very same responsibilities, you are actually now having to deal with them while also doing your work. So nothing changes, and the flexible hours can never be the same for all of us, because of the responsibilities that we know for the fact that women have got more responsibilities in terms of minding the children and doing some house chores. It's few men that assist, but majority of women still feel the brunt of taking care of their jobs and making sure that things at the home front are being taken care of. So it's never the same, one size fits all when we talk about flexible hours. And then we need to make sure that if the world, not just South Africa, the world over, that we need to make sure that determining the education of a woman determines the well-being of society. It's also about making sure that as women, whether we do it out of ourselves or through the employer or whatever, also empowering ourselves can also make a very good step in making sure that we are able to can fight and be able to be on those platforms we deserve. Because sometimes there's this problem in our societies when women have applied for posts, then we'll be asked about experience, which never happens to men. In many cases, it's like they are automatic. So we need to deal with that also, that there's no shop that sells experience except you being in the post or in the position where you can learn and gain that particular experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question, Astrid.
Thank you. I'm not going to necessarily want to repeat what the previous speakers said, but from some of the presentations, my challenge that I find is that we can go and we can enact legislation. We can talk about how affirmative action and employment equity measures are being applied when it comes to women. But I think when it comes to the real practicality of how women are being dealt with in a workplace is a different story. And that is what is avoiding us from what reality actually is. I had a member who about a year ago said to me that, Astrid, I started doing my LLB. And in the process, whilst I was doing my LLB, I ended up, I started having my children. After having my children, I raised them whilst I was studying. Sooner, I started facing a divorce. I lost the child that was with me in foster care. I had to deal with the trauma and the emotional recovery all on my own. My employer has noted that I have not finished my qualification and started asking, you need to repay your bursary. There was no justification for what you had to experience as a woman in your workplace as well as in your working life, yet you had to deal with it in the practical sense of it. A few years later, she again attempted to do her master's in, say, business administration. In the process, yes, unfortunately, she was in another relationship or marriage whereby her husband would only allow her to sleep about a few hours in an evening. And she suffered domestic abuse and all emotional abuse that goes with it. Unfortunately, she could not finish her qualifications because that opportunity was not afforded to her, and she had to repay back the funds that was given to her as well. Then, a few years later, she applied for posts, and it was said to her that you have got a tendency not to finish what you start. You cannot commit to studies. You do not have the formal qualifications, and nor are you able to gain the necessary experience in order for you to get even promoted or considered. The challenge, however, remains that even though we make provision, we are not addressing the key and the core issues on what it is that is actually holding women back. We don't deal with the discrimination other than those that we can see and what is provided for in legislation. We are not looking at the actual issues that is really causing you that disadvantage, and that is the actual cause of inequality still in the workplace between a woman and a man. And we do not even put in steps or mechanisms in order to address or achieve that. For us, the standard is still exactly the same. Whether you are a woman or whether you are a man, when it comes to competing against a man for any promotion or whatever it is, the bottom line is still the measure which is used to judge the two is always going to be unequal, and it will remain unequal unless we, and somebody said we need men. Yes, we do need men, but this is actually an indictment on women themselves. We cannot keep on stepping back and say, change my workplace, change my environment, and make it more easier for me when you can't even yourself rise for yourself in your same circumstances. And it is time for us as well. And for all of those women and especially, and I'm talking on behalf of somebody who works at a trade union, that needs to know the responsibility that you carry and that you have when it comes to considering and looking at life objectively, and your role that you have to play as a woman in changing the narrative, in changing the message that's in society. My question would, however, be, with those gaps, how do we then not necessarily create more measures as far as equity legislation or whatever is required, but how do we genuinely address the gaps that is there in the workplace for women? Thank you, Chair.
Mavis, those are all the questions in the hall. I'm not sure if there's any questions online that you've picked up. All right, I see Tina Roos is online with a question. Tina, you can unmute and continue with your question.
Thank you, Frikkie. My question or comment is specifically for Bristol Base. He had quite an interesting presentation. Unfortunately, I've not been able to see his paper, and I would love to see his paper. My question to him specifically is, he started very interesting and explaining the role of his mother and so forth. And what I would like to know is, in his title, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, have you given any thought to how intersectionality, specifically in a South African context, can influence his study as a variable? There's very few studies in South Africa that focus on intersectionality. And I think it would be interesting for me to hear if he has given any thought to including that variable in his study. Thank you, Frikkie.
Thank you, Tina. Mavis, I don't see any other hands online, and there's no hands in the audience.
Yes.
I'm not sure if we should just maybe read out the questions in the chat, because the people in the room physically does not have the advantage of being able to be online to read the chat questions, and maybe just read them out before we then go to the answer session.
Okay, thank you very much, Vicky. Yes, that's fine. On the chat box, we have a question that says, one wishes to ask if there has been any relook on defining what is the workplace during pandemics, and therefore the impact on occupational health and safety. Another one is that what are the disparities in pay and the intervention from the King 4 report on how is the principle of equal pay for work or of equal value being advanced, especially to challenge the very disparity? Those are the only questions that I have, including that one post from the floor in the physical meeting for Bristol. So I would ask Bristol to go on and answer that question on intersectionality, and if he has really given any thought on incorporating it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So that will actually touch on what the first question was also about. The first question also dealt with this sense of intersectionality, which I do deal with in the greater paper. Remember, for this purposes, we could only write about 8,000 words. And I think I actually added a few more words to 11,000. But yeah, I do touch on intersectionality because that is a big thing for my paper, especially talking about from maternity to parental leave. And the issue that the first question was about is specifically addressing that issue of being Black, being a female, and then also the issue of not being properly capacitated. But also on what I think Charlene also addressed is that women are capacitated. It is just the opportunities are not there. And also we allow them to enter, but we do not make it easy for them to stay, which is what I think Astrid also touched on. But yes, to answer the question about intersectionality, yes, that is an important part of my chapter. So I think you will be privy to the paper that I wrote, but I think also in my thesis itself, that part is actually a 20,000 word chapter in and of itself. So yeah, so I do touch on that aspect because it is important. Thank you.
Chair, if I could just come in and just make a few comments on some of the comments that was made. Firstly, it was just heartwarming to hear from the women worker leaders in the room. Our male leaders, your silence is deafening. To answer Comrade Tumeling's question on the issue of the Principle 14 of the King 4 report, and how is that addressing the issue in terms of furthering the remuneration or addressing the disparity of remuneration. I just quickly want to read what does the Principle 14 says. And highlight to you my issue with Principle 14. Principle 14 of the King 4 report on remuneration governance says, the governing body should, and let me re-emphasize, should, not must, ensure that organizations remunerates fairly, responsibly, and transparently as to promote the achievement of strategic objectives and positive outcomes in short, medium, and long term. So there is no imperative on organizations to ensure that they must address remuneration disparities. They should. And as long as there's that disparities or that ability for companies to should, they never must. Looking at a more recent report by PwC in 2021, particularly looking at JSE companies and looking at positions that females occupy within JSE listed companies, only 13% of executives on the JSE are female, 13%. In numerical terms, it equates to 81 women. only 81 women in executive posts on JSE listed companies. So I hear the president of POCRU, Comrade Bonnie, you're right. Until women start to get opportunities to be in those positions in the World Economic Forum and so forth, it will have to take us to change, to bring change for us. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Is my mic on? Chair, there's just one thing I wanted to add. I think there was a question also that the first speaker or the first person who asked the question raised as well, was with reference to the career progression. So career progression, yes, I do deal specifically with the capacity issues in terms of career progression. And like I said, it is a big chapter. So it does deal with that issue there as well. And then just lastly was the part of, so men needs to get used to this idea of women being in control or taking charge. And yes, I do recognize that it is a paradigm shift that we need to make, but that paradigm shift will start with, and this is touching on what Astrid asked earlier on, I'm of the view, and I don't know if it is because I study law, but I'm of the view that law shapes and steers society. So that's the beginning of things. I also do believe that we are overregulated. But what we need to do is, so I'm not proposing that we add more laws. I'm saying we've got the existing laws. We need to adjust it and we need to do those necessary paradigm shifts in the workplace. But it's going to start with law because remember, law creates order. And not everyone wants to be a criminal except if you're a psychopath. But you know, so let's start. That's a starting point for me and it will then triple from there. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Bristol. I think with that, I don't know whether there is anything, you know, for us to wrap up the discussions. We have a few more minutes, 15 minutes before we can close the discussion. And I would like to ask if there's anything that you want to add before we close. Tembi, Natalie, Charlene, Fikile, Bristol has really given us quite a bit, and Anisha. If there isn't anything that you want to say by way of your final words, maybe we can just go on and conclude the session. Thank you very much to the presenters, Tembi, Natalie, Charlene, Fikile, Bristol, and Anisha. And it's unfortunate that we are not able to hear Batwandwa. And the discussions have been really quite informative in that they will help us as labor and employees relations specialists. I think throughout the presentations, we have seen that inequality of opportunity and treatment outcomes between men and women still persist, and that achieving gender equality in the workplace remains one of the biggest challenges for government, social partners, and management at enterprise level. Gender-based discrimination often occurs at the recruitment stage on grounds of pregnancy or potential childbearing and rearing, and the gender pay gap remains high across the world. In addition, women are more likely to be affected by violence at work, whether physical, psychological, or sexual. And we've seen an increase in this during the pandemic. Therefore, throughout this session, we've really focused on the obstacles to gender equality at work and also recommendations in terms of how collective bargaining can be used as an effective tool to overcome these challenges. We thank you very much for the participation in this session. We've seen, professionals, scholars, we've seen trade union activists, within the session. So it was well represented and balanced. And therefore, with those few words, I just want to thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Friki, for also assisting in the session. We've come to the end of this session. Thank you very much. I hand over to you, Friki.
Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause to all the ladies. And all the applaud you heard came from men in the room, applauding the women. Mavis, thank you very much from our side as well for you being willing to chair. the session and giving us that time as well. We do appreciate it. Ladies, men in this room, we are all converted. That's why we don't have questions. We agree with you. We can't enter into a debate which we agree with. You are empowered and you are there. So thank you very much. Any woman with a credit card here? We've got a bill to pay, but nonetheless, we'll focus on that at a later stage. People, we've made up some time due to some of the discussions in the panel. I know Comrade Vici still has to, she wants an answer on the issue of culture and the impact of the cultural processes. So Bristol and Shalane has agreed that they will engage you in tea, over tea, and they will speak to you about that process as well. From Satu, yes, on the issue of culture. People, we are going to break for tea. Those people online as well, you can maybe just stand down for a while. Let's reconvene in 30 minutes as per the program at 11:20, and then we can start with the last two sessions of the Congress. Thank you very much. All right, people, we're going to start. Can we take our seats? Thank you very much. We are coming to the last session of the Congress before closure. Thank you for being here, and thank you also for those people that are online that have come back to also share this last part of the last session with us. The last session is a special panel discussion. Comrade Basi. The last session is a special panel discussion on the freedom of association, and we are fortunate that that would be chaired by the chairperson of the ILO's Committee on Freedom of Association, Professor Evans Kulula. Professor, thank you very much.
Good morning, colleagues and friends. I realize that this is the last session, and thank you again, Frick, for this privilege to facilitate this session. Freedom of association, in a sense, has been around now in ILO terms for 70 years. It was established in 1952. And for those of you who don't know, one of my dubious claims to fame is that I was born 1952. So I'm as old as when it was established. This year was the 70th anniversary, but it actually didn't start working until a year later. So the real kind of work anniversary is coming next year. I am very much obliged, most obliged to the local organizing committee, Friki and his colleagues for including this topic as a panel discussion. In terms of the panel we have, I wouldn't wish for a better panel. We have three distinguished and leading practitioners and experts on freedom of association. Let me introduce them beforehand. They will take turns. I will introduce them in the order in which they appear. The first one is Dr. Christina Holmgren, another friend of South Africa. You remember at the beginning, I introduced to you Mrs. Cynthia Samia, who is a friend of South Africa, and so is Christina. Christina has had a distinguished career, both with the main UN, but particularly with the ILO, which she joined in 1996. In addition to her work as a specialist, in fact, she recently went into active retirement. As you can see, she's still active, and we are better for that because we are lucky to have her make time to be with us. She retired this year. She was a senior international labor standards specialist. And you could say Christina is also an old Africa hand, so to speak, because it's not only in South Africa that she stopped. She served for a while in Ethiopia as well, in Addis Ababa, at I think that the ILO regional, I think that was the time the regional office, the Africa regional office, had not gone back to Abidjan. And she has credentials that, besides experience, her academic credentials are impressive. Not only does she hold a PhD, but she has other degrees as well. She's originally from Sweden. At least Sweden is her mother's place. Her mother is French. So I think in a sense, for me, she represents the universality that ILERA is. And of course, she has, quite wisely, I think, good judgment, Christina. She has decided to stop here for now. And I can assure you, Christina, that that is a wise decision. And my wife, Sebastiana, and I have got almost 30 years of having been lucky to stop in South Africa. And we feel better for it. Our second speaker is an incredible practitioner. And, you know, we see Kaiser Muyane. Kaiser Muyane and I, if I may name drop, go back quite a bit. We were the pioneers, you might say, of the minimum wage kind of aspirations of South Africa. We served together on the Employment Conditions Commission. You remember that was the initial commission that Tito Mboweni set up to look after vulnerable workers. And Kaiser was a leading member of that, a stalwart of that. And I am delighted to tell you that, you know, he has recently joined the Committee on Freedom of Association. In fact, from October session onwards. In terms of his current occupation, Kaiser is currently head of employee relations, transformation and compliance at Sanlam group of companies, which I think I find reassuring because I've got my mega pension with them. And if they have got somebody like Kaiser, I think my pension is safe. He represents organized business in various capacities, including as chair of the Social Policy Standing Committee of Business South Africa, convener of business at NEDLAC, member of the governing body of the CCMA, is commissioner with the national minimum wage, and that is the successor, as I said, to the Employment Conditions Commission in a way, and is a member of the ILO governing body, and of course, has recently also been appointed a member of the Committee on Freedom of Association. Our last speaker on the panel does not need any introduction. Marius Orifi is a legend both in his commitment, as I mentioned, to South Africa and the rest of Africa, through his scholarship and expertise. He has been the sort of a fellow traveler with Frick, if I may put it that way, in ensuring that LERESA, you know, stands the test of time and confirms the contribution to ILERA. And Marius, as you know, is the chair of the organizing committee of this conference. And the way it has gone, I think, speaks for itself. It's a gem, sort of I might add, a treasure of sorts for us in terms of labor relations, not only as a labor law scholar, but also as, I think, one who connects a bridge between academic scholarship and practical application of labor law. And of course, freedom of association is one of his fortes, and he's going to, you know, to give us a sense of that. So now those are our panel speakers, and I said one wouldn't wish for a better panel. In terms of the way we are going to proceed, Christina will start off and give an overview of international labor standards. And she's particularly keen to collect it to what freedom of association, international labor standards mean in the time of COVID. And she will lead us in that, and she will be followed by Kaiser, and Kaiser is going to focus more or less on a case study of South Africa in terms of how freedom of association has fared, in practical terms. And Marius will wind up with an overview of what the African situation looks like. So, colleagues, we can't hope for a better kind of panel. I should mention to the panelists that the time is tight, and please, sort of be mindful of time. I know two of you have got the PowerPoints, and I'll suggest that you speak to them rather than sort of go through them. Kaiser, I think, is going to, being the sort of the negotiator and the trench worker he is going to speak from his notes. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure, my great pleasure, to invite Christina to make our presentation. Christina, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the panel. I'm very pleased to be here, even though it's only virtually, but we are now getting used to it. So I think it's a very interesting opportunity also to present principles I have close to my heart, because I have personally been very worried about the limitations to civil liberties that have taken place worldwide following the handling of the pandemic. So I think this is an excellent opportunity to also highlight some basic freedom association principles in this context. Now, I know that there is my PowerPoint is supposed to be presented by ILERA, so I will let them. Thank you very much. So if we can go to next slide, please. What I'm going to very quickly enumerate the principle of freedom association in the ILO, but extremely quickly because of time constraints, and also some main freedom association principles and rights that are of particular relevance in the handling of the COVID-19. So these two points will be just a quick refresher of the fact that many of us know, but I think we must, it's necessary to remind us of them because to set the stage. Then, what does the ILO say about freedom association principles in times of crisis? Can we derogate to them, yes or no, and to what extent? Then we go after that, and then I'll present particularly the principle developed regarding state of emergencies, because a number of countries in the world have adopted state of emergency regulations in order to handle this pandemic. What does the ILO supervisory body say in regard to that? Then firstly, what principles have been developed by the ILO Committee of Experts on the application of conventions recommendations in response to the handling of the COVID pandemic worldwide. There was this is very new, very recent. So the Committee of Experts only met in November, December 2020, and set some basic principles, but they are not really yet very COVID specific, but we will see within which framework it has set the framework for developing particular principles. And then fifthly, my conclusion is, how can we contribute to the development of principles? So this is avenue for the social partners mainly, but not only, of course. And six, I haven't put it here. I have included a slide with some extra reading that I would recommend for those who are interested. And I will not present it, but I will leave it there. And some of them have, the next slide, please, have website reference, so it will be easy. So I know I was asked not to speak to them. I just want to quickly remind us of when the freedom association principle was enshrined in the ILO, and it has been enshrined many times in times of crisis. 1919 to start with, at the creation of the ILO, after the First World War, the principle of freedom association is a recognized constitutional preamble. It's in the principle. In 1944, by the adoption of Philadelphia Declaration, also reaffirmed the principle, and this is just before, is on the eve of the end of the Second World War. So again, time of world crisis. And then we have the adoption of the two conventions we know very well, 87 on freedom of association and 98 on the right to organize collective bargaining. And they are both core conventions and closely interrelated. Without social dialogue, these two conventions cannot be fully operational, and the active role of social partners. And then finally, we also have a recommendation that was adopted in 2017 on in times of crisis, which both reaffirm freedom association and collective bargaining. If we can go to next slide. Thank you. The importance of these principles, we know there are enabling conventions necessary for all other labor rights, and in the program I have seen many of these labor rights that have been discussed, social protection, migrant workers, and many others. So with these two conventions really are the basis for social partners to move forward regarding these rights. I mentioned their core conventions. What is the state of ratification of these conventions in Africa? Well, all states have ratified Convention 98 on collective bargaining, so it's a perfect state. And Convention 87, only 3 countries miss to make it fully applicable here. So that shows a very wide acceptance of these two conventions and their principles in the continent. They're also at the core of the ILO mandate of social justice, and they have been subject to the development of an abundant set of principles by the two main ILO supervisory bodies, namely the committee of experts I had mentioned, and the Freedom of Association Committee, chaired by Professor Ivan Skalugla, and I just learned that we have our panelist Kaiser Moyane is also a member of. So both these committees have developed very abundant set of principles. So it's crucial to take account of these. Two main aspects of the convention. Convention 87 in our context aims at protecting the social partners, employers and workers equally, from state interference. And that is very important in our context. And the Convention 98 provides for protection against anti-union discrimination and provide for the duty for the state to facilitate negotiation of collective agreements. So then I want to mention, and I will mention it later, that there is also a resolution from 1970, a 1978 resolution on linking freedom of association and other civil liberties. I'll get back to that shortly. Next slide. So here, some main freedom of association principles that are challenged by the handling of the COVID pandemic. And I'm saying on purpose handling, it's not by the COVID pandemic, but it's the way different states have handled that. And I'm saying that because we have seen in the world how these rights have been restricted to a very large extent. And usually I'm not a very nationalistic person, but I'm very happy to be a Swedish national, because I've seen that in our country, we haven't resorted to so much of this. I mean, I may get a surprise. So it's really how different states have handled this pandemic. So the first one, which is obviously the right to assembly and demonstration. And this is a principle that we can find, amongst others, in the Digest of the Freedom Association Committee of 2018, the last one, in the paragraph 208 that states the right to assembly and demonstrations, including 1st of May. And if I take an example of my country again, okay, the conditions in Sweden are very different from other countries. I'm very aware of that. But we had 1st of May demonstrations online. I'm very aware that this may be difficult in some countries where you don't have a widespread online access. But there are ways if there is a will. So the right to assembly and demonstration is set up. The freedom to organize activities and formulate programs is also put forward in paragraph 202 with some limitations allowed in 203, and namely public order, right to elect representatives in full freedom. Again, this is also a principle that is clear and affirmed by the Freedom Association Committee, amongst others. The right to strike, this is not an absolute right, but it has been also the attention has been drawn to that right. Of course, freedom of opinion, expression, and assembly are crucial, are the sine qua non for the exercise of freedom of association, and this is stated in the paragraph 205, without interference from states. And in the paragraph 1187, workers and employees organizations shall enjoy adequate protection against acts of interference in their establishment, functioning, administration. And then we have the importance of social dialogue throughout all levels, because without social dialogue, we cannot have freedom of association, collective bargaining. So in a number of countries, this right have been severely limited. In other countries, this has been well managed. So there are a lot of different experiences. So we know the main challenges are lockdown, social or physical isolation, teleworking, enterprise closures, etc. I'm not going to go through them more because we know these challenges. If we can go to next slide. So having set these principles, what does the ILO say about their application in times of crisis and particularly in times of state of emergency? Because the notion of state of emergency is not included in any of the two conventions, but as I mentioned, the two ILO supervisory bodies have developed a set of rules in this regard. First of all, the pandemic is very recent and there have not been any particular principles and rules that have regarding freedom of association that have been developed at this stage. But a lot of principles regarding state of emergency and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So if the first basic principle has been laid down, is to be found in the Committee of Experts General Survey of 1994, paragraphs 41 to 42. This is important because it has been quoted a number of times. It's like a reference in this regard. And I will say that I will quote and say that the Freedom Association Conventions contain no provisions allowing the invocation of a state of urgency to justify exemption from the obligations arising under the conventions or any suspension of application. This motive is frequently invoked and the exercise of trade union rights is seriously endangered thereby. Such a pretext cannot be used to justify restrictions on the civil liberties that are essential to the proper exercise of trade union rights, except in circumstances of extreme gravity, like, and it quotes, acts of God, serious disruption of civil order, etc., and on condition that any measures affecting the application of the convention are limited in scope and duration to what is strictly necessary to deal with the situation in question. And then it refers to civil liberties. So this sets the stage for what is acceptable and not acceptable regarding state of emergencies. The digest of the Freedom Association Committee includes a paragraph on 299 that reaffirms the general rule that no provision allows for derogations based on the state of emergency. And it's two paragraphs later on says in paragraph 300 that above has been reaffirmed on several occasions, and I quote a little bit, and talks about what is meant by temporary. And then when a state of emergency has continued over a period of several years with serious restrictions of trade union rights and civil liberties, it is necessary to safeguard certain freedom of association rights. So it means the state of emergency cannot be invoked and go on forever. I know of a North African country that has been ruling under a state of emergency for 14 years. They cannot be held as a state of emergency rule. It's really a governance mode. And then the Freedom Association would continue under paragraph 301, saying that governments may enact emergency regulations that restrict organization of public meetings and applicable to.
Sorry to interrupt you. 5 minutes, please. Please begin winding up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you. So next slide, please. So principles have been developed by the Committee of Experts, and in the last slide of my presentation, I have included a website reference. So I would really invite you to read those, and I have also mentioned which principles are applicable. So you have general principles and a particular set of principles regarding freedom of association. I think I will go directly to the general principles. I will just mention the 1970 ILERA resolution, which links, which states that freedom of association can only be operational in the context of the full respect of civil and political rights, and these are laid down in the United Nations First Declaration of Human Rights, but also in the 1969 Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So they are to be placed there. We see the 4 principles here, and I will leave you to read those and to read those paragraphs, and ask you to go to the next slide, please. Here, yes, we have principle of legality that is a concern by the Committee of Experts, also concerned over the exponential accumulation of executive power, which means that civil society, including social partners, in a number of instances are not included in the adoption of either decrees or regulations or laws, or in any measures aimed at handling this pandemic. It also draws the attention to the challenge of maintaining a number of principles, including the interrelations of human rights, because right to health is one right, but you have also right to economic livelihood. How do we balance these rights? This is a question I'm asking. And then draw the attention to the fact that a number of groups have been suffering from discrimination in result of the adoption of certain measures. Next slide, please. So some specific principles have been developed by the Committee of Experts regarding freedom of association in this context. It recalls the importance of the link between civil liberties and freedom of association, and it recalls also the 1970 resolution that I have mentioned. It stresses the need to maintain permanent and intensive dialogue with the social partners, particularly in the process of adopting legislation. It refers to work undertaken by our sister organization regarding the limitations to human rights, and it talks, the UN Special Rapporteur has developed a set of 10 principles that are crucial in this context. I will leave you to read those, and the High Commissioner has also expressed her concern about the need to balance the public health with other basic human rights. Next slide. So, and next slide again. So here, since we're in the beginning of this pandemic, and since we just have, you heard just general parameters that have been developed, how can we get more precise, more specific rules on what is acceptable and not acceptable as regards freedom of association principles? And there are 2 ways to do that, and I would really urge the social partners to make use of the avenues that are available in the ILO. And one is to make use of the reporting procedures. So when a country has ratified a convention, the government has to submit a report on how it applies the convention. The social partners can agree or disagree and bring their comments to that, either under Article 22 or 23. I really would think it's very important if social partners have queries or things that measures have been adopted which are not in line with the respect of freedom of association principles, that actually these reports are produced and they're sent, and it's time to do that now because the committee of experts examination is starting end of November this year, and the standards department is receiving the reports now. So I really urge all those who haven't done so to submit the reports, or to submit if a social partner is of the view that a serious infringement has taken place to freedom association in this context, to submit a case to the Freedom Association Committee. And now you have here the chair of the committee, which is Professor Ivan Salula, and you have another member, Kaiser Moyamet. So I really think it would be a good opportunity to send this so that the two supervisory bodies have the opportunity to examine all these allegations, to set rules that guide us for the future. It's also interesting because some government reports may include positive measures and that can serve as an inspiration for other countries. So I really think it's very important, and I'm personally very worried about the state of how liberties, including of freedom association, are being restricted. So I think it's really, we've seen how freedom association is important in times of crisis, and we also know what can happen in times of crisis with social unrest. So I really would urge social partners to make use of this and to contribute to the development of the jurisprudence, if I can call that, or the development of principles. And then last slide. And this is some extra reading, which I will leave you to have a look at. Thank you very much. I hope I was not too long. I may have been too long, but I did my best. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christina. Let's give her. That was wonderful as always. We most obliged to you. And thank you very much for making time to be with us. I think what you have presented has said for itself. And I do sincerely hope that we'll have a few minutes to pick up in terms of comments and questions. Our next panelist is Kaiser Myane. Are you online, Kaiser?
Yes, I am, Prof.
Yeah, and he is going to, as I said, give us the picture as it is, such in the trenches, from the trenches, using South Africa, of course, as a case study of sorts. Kaiser, please go ahead. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Prof. And good morning still it is, colleagues, those who are at least in South Africa and around. And thank you very much for those kind words, Prof, in your introduction. And I am much obliged also to Christina for her presentation, which is a nice segue for me as I pick up on that to introduce the South African case. Perhaps I should start off by affirming that freedom of association is a fundamental human right as proclaimed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It is the enabling right that allows effective participation by non-state actors in economic and social policy, and one could say it is the heartbeat of democracy. And so I propose looking at how this fundamental right has been demonstrated in practice in the case of South Africa, especially in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. But before I get to the substance, just a couple of points. So freedom of association in South Africa is a constitutional right. It's enshrined in Section 23 of our Constitution. And in South Africa, this freedom of association has historical significance. As colleagues probably know, that economic activities in South Africa during the apartheid was fairly restricted to especially Black people. So trade unions became the vehicle for political expression as Black people could at least express themselves in the context of workers. And so it was no surprise, I suppose, that when democracy came in 1994, South Africa opted to institutionalize social dialogue as an expression of this fundamental right or freedom of association in what is called NEDLAC for short, through an act of parliament, the NEDLAC Act. And it was in fact one of the first acts of the democratic government to be enacted in South Africa. So NEDLAC is where government, business, labor, and civil society, which is unique to South Africa. You know, most countries speak of the tripartite. In South Africa, we've got the tripartite plus. That's where they meet to tackle socio-economic policy issues. So when COVID-19 struck and the country went into lockdown, as many countries did around the world in early 2019, leaders of government, of business, labor, and civil society organizations went to work at NEDLAC. And with threats of job losses being a daily reality, as many businesses were forced to close down or scale back, at least, trade unions could easily have resorted to their tried and tested power of organizing strikes in protest. As in fact, it is allowed in our law, where job losses are occurring, especially on scale, that unions can certainly go on strikes and protest. And the prevention of large gatherings, I think this is the point that Christina was also touching on, through these emergency regulations, lockdown regulations, could easily have been seen as adding fuel to the fire as well. But instead, leaders of all social partners in South Africa put their differences aside and collaborated at NEDLAC to save both lives and livelihoods. In meeting over many days and sometimes nights, the social partners managed to thresh out a package of measures to intervene in the economy and society to cushion the impacts of the pandemic. And these measures and interventions were the bedrock of government's announced 500 billion assistance package that you probably are all familiar with. So in all of that, what exactly can we highlight that was achieved through this process of social dialogue at NEDLAC? I'll mention just a few. So for workers, there were gains for workers, or package measures for workers, for employers, and for society at large. For workers, the social partners agreed to extend what we call temporary employer-employee relief scheme through our unemployment fund. These protected workers against loss of income, and in some cases even prevented dismissals or layoffs, as companies were able to access some of these payments for their workers who were not able to earn any income during the downtime. There were also a series of regulations, health and safety regulations, that sought to protect workers from infections whilst they were at work. That included provision of PPEs and just emphasizing the need for all the non-pharmaceutical interventions by organizations to make sure that their workers were protected, and also included an insertion in the regulations of a provision that sought to protect workers from being dismissed if they refused to work in conditions they felt were unsafe due to possible COVID-19 infections. There were also regulations about public transport that once again was while workers will be traveling to and from work, that they should also not be unduly exposed to possible infections. And so these were all threshed out at NEDLEC and signed off, by the relevant government executives, obviously to protect the workers. For employers, there were also gains. So that same temporary employer-employee relief scheme was also accessible to employers. This would obviously cushion them against having to pay wages when employees were not productive or when they were not operating. There was also the announcement by the National Treasury in South Africa of that loan guarantee scheme. It was to the tune of up to 200 billion rands. In other words, this was meant to be accessible credit to businesses that were struggling, so that they could either resume their operations or carry on, without much distress. And for society, beyond employers and workers, you probably all know about the 350 relief social distress grant that was paid to people who were not employed or were not accessing any other form of state assistance. There were food parcels that were given to people that really needed them. There was provision of personal protective equipment, and COVID-19 test kits were purchased through the Solidarity Fund, which was once again an example of our social partners came together as a response to the pandemic. It's not a government fund, it's not a business fund, it's not labor, it's basically a fund of all social partners. And I think most importantly, the government's vaccination program that is still ongoing had also its gestation in NEDLEC, and is being pushed by the leadership of all the social partners through NEDLEC to try and reach what government calls herd immunity, and government's target of 70% of the population vaccinated by the end of the year. And you will probably know of efforts to intensify this program over the coming weeks before the fourth wave hits, and it will see once again leaders of the social partners collaborating in the national effort to speed that up. It's not just for vaccination's sake, it is obviously meant to be the catalyst for economic recovery, so that we can save both lives and livelihoods in the country. Now, as I conclude, I think, colleagues, it's safe to say that whilst COVID-19 has disrupted life as we knew it, things could easily have been much worse in this country. But the organizational capabilities of social partners and the avenue of a structure like NEDLEC were critical catalysts, in my opinion, in the country's response to the pandemic. While many employers could have opted to retrench workers due to economic hardship, and trade unions could have opted for visible protests in response to job losses, all social partners chose instead to collaborate at NEDLEC to agree on measures to assist both employers and workers and society at large. Driving the COVID-19 vaccination program, with all its challenges, is a commitment of all social partners, as I've said. This will expedite economic recovery and a return to normal life. So in short, respect for freedom of association, especially as it is manifested in social dialogue, is paying off dividends in South Africa in the context of the pandemic. And I think I'll pause there, Prof, and hopefully there's a bit of time for us to engage on a little later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaiser. We are delighted with your presentation, and as you say, we hope you can come back to some of the issues I think you have raised, and they are significant, of course, is that they come from a lived experience. We'll come back to you, but thank you very much for that. Let's now move on. Marius, would you come up, please? I think you better see. Better go and use that mic there. Yeah, yes. Where there is a mic. There's a mic there. Okay, you were okay. No. Then you take. Do the podium. Do the podium. It's better at the podium. I think. Yes. Sure.
Thank you, Chair Evans, for the kind introduction. Let me just get our first slide up here. How do I do that? Okay, there we are. Ladies and gentlemen, on this last day, in almost the last session, we are dealing with a topic that is of huge importance for this continent, as already became clear through the two brilliant contributions that we have had from our two colleagues, Kaiser and Christina, in the first place, and Kaiser. My focus now in the next 10 minutes or so is on freedom of association in Africa and the role of the ILO, to gauge where we stand, what has happened, where are some of the remaining problems, and what can and should be done. Not everything is clear-cut, not everything is uncontroversial, as you will hear. But let me say in the first place that if we look at a historical picture of deficiencies in freedom of association worldwide, but certainly also in Africa, then this is typical the picture that we saw and we are still seeing in a few of our African countries. The legislative framework, which would not properly allow for freedom of association. This country was certainly an example of this until at least 1995. The control and repression of trade unions, although they made particular inroads into the as part of the attempt to bring political freedom to the continent. And I must say, it is really sad that even after political freedom has come to some countries, this has been followed in some countries, some of them presented here as well, by a new era, or perhaps the first time an era of trade union repression. Criminal prosecution of trade union leaders for exercising their trade union rights, infringement of strike and protest action beyond what the ILO normative framework would foresee. These are some of the typical scenarios that we have seen all over the continent, much less hopefully today than in the past. There are several countries in particular that have been affected by freedom of association issues dealt with by the ILO. And perhaps I should say, we do not already know this, that of course Evans is also the chair of the Freedom of Association Committee of the ILO, an absolute critical role that he fulfills and that the committee does. And these are perhaps the 5 most prominent examples in the continent where we have seen in the last few decades, in fact, going back to the 60s, 1960s, affected by infringements of freedom of association: Burundi, Eswatini, South Africa, Sudan, Zimbabwe. I'm going to say a few words about some of them later if we have time, so let me not deal with them now, but when we perhaps do a bit of evaluation in the end. But now there is something else, and that is our understanding of freedom of association, and certainly this is the ILO understanding, and I must say this is the UN understanding more generally as well of freedom of association, goes far beyond just, let's call it, trade union and employer organization freedom to organize themselves, you know, to act independently, etc. It goes far beyond this. And if we can set our mindset or reset our mindset to understand how extensive this notion actually is. I mean, it is really accepted nowadays that freedom of association includes social justice considerations, democratization considerations. And let me just read this one, one quotation from a recent compilation of decisions of the Committee on Freedom of Association, ILO. I quote, "Occupation interests which workers defend through the exercise of the right to strike do not only concern labor working conditions or collective claims of an occupational nature, but importantly now, also the seeking of solutions to economic and social policy questions, which are of direct concern to workers," unquote. So what is it that is a concern of workers? What is necessary for the exercise of socioeconomic rights by workers, and of course, also their dependents? And also the need to ensure a proper environment for stable labor relations. If you have an unstable political or repressive political environment, you cannot have an environment for stable labor relations. So we can see the rationale for what we have there. So then integrally embedded in this domain of social justice are considerations relating to, and let me just run through them, and we don't have time to discuss them, but each of these dimensional elements are absolutely critically part, each one of them is critically part of this understanding, this wider understanding of freedom of association, the social justice concept, the state's social contract with its people and in particular workers. Secondly, the universal emphasis nowadays on the commitment to leave no one behind as a key UN Sustainable Development Objective. Thirdly, the global endorsement of the Decent Work for All framework, in particular propagated, if I could use the word, by the ILO and through the good work the ILO has been doing in this area. The importance of social dialogue, self-explanatory. Finally, the confirmation of sustainable livelihoods as an overarching developmental outcome. And all that I've just told you actually are now encapsulated or expressed in the recent report of the ILO Global Commission on the Future of Work, and given effect to in the subsequent ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work 2019. So that is the context. And given that context, what have we seen? Let me use a minute or two to tell, well, most of us would know about this, of course, the remarkable results that we have seen of the ILO's involvement in the freedom of association area, given this wider understanding of freedom of association as far as South Africa is concerned. As we all know, that in 1966, under the old regime, South Africa withdrew from the ILO. There was a complaint in 1988 by COSATU about lack of freedom of association in South Africa. The ILO then had to request permission from South African government to send an investigative structure or institution called the Fact-Finding Conciliation Commission. Of course, South Africa at that stage was a withdrawn member of the ILO, so the ILO did not have the right to come to the country just because of membership. So interestingly, South African government agreed. The commission came, did a magnificent work in terms of unearthing all the issues that were relevant in this broader freedom of association domain, indicating to what extent the legal framework, but more than that is also the practice, was still not in line with the ILO's, the UN understanding of freedom of association. Some of you may have read actually the report of the commission, really an eye-opener and written in a style that's has got this conciliatory language. Now, the important thing to say is that it's more important to know what happened afterwards and the role that this report played, this freedom of association report, if I could use the term. It's clear to any one of us working in this area that this really informed, if not prompted, the major changes we have seen in the labor legislation, the 1995 Labor Relations Act. What you see in that act in relation to this understanding of freedom of association, in my view, is a direct reflection of the work contained in the report of the commission. Of course, South Africa then returned to the ILO, and we have seen several other developments in the country since then, legally speaking, but also in other senses. NETLAC was established as a tripartite institution, more than tripartite actually, right. Equally important, we say, have been the ILO contribution to fostering democratization and the demise of autocratic systems affecting workers in Eswatini, an incomplete process, as we all know, and Sudan, and but of course also in Burundi. Colleagues, if there's time, then we'll talk about that maybe in question time, because I think we want to say a few other things too. So in other words, anybody working in this area, and you don't even have to be a researcher, it would be clear that the work that the ILO has done in this area of freedom of association has had profound implications for workers and societies as well in Africa. In particular, opportunities and prospects for further dedicated ILO engagement in a freedom of association context remain through its supervisory mechanisms, the Committee of Freedom of Association being one, and its structures, but also importantly, its norm-setting role and its operational activity that it is involved in. Now, finally, let me just deal with two critical categories of workers in the continent and do a bit of reflection of where we stand, what the role of the ILO has been, also at the RICS and the continental level in particular, and then to indicate some of the shortcomings where further work needs to be done. Both these categories have been covered to some extent in the Congress. The one concerns workers in the informal economy, also in relation to their social protection. So what have we seen the work of the ILO in this regard? At the normative level, we have seen the responses. May I say, and I don't want to sound overcritical, rather late responses, because I remember very well in 2004 when, in fact, Evans and I participated in a conference in Zambia where we raised these issues, even to the ILO, and said, you know, what is happening with social protection for the informal economy? And the response was, well, formalize them, and then we extend social protection to all of them once they're formalized. And that led to a visit to the ILO in Geneva, where this was formally, or at least informally, taken up with the ILO, not just in Geneva, but elsewhere as well, to say, this region says, if I could use the word, how can I put it, that you really have to come up with appropriate responses to deal with social protection for people in the informal economy, because this continent knows that is the reality of the context. And ladies and gentlemen, it took at least 8 more years, if not 11 more years, before we have seen the ILO response. The first formal response is in the ILO recommendation 202, where there are two very brief references to this, but more importantly, recommendation 204 of 2015, which set out a whole framework of guidelines, because it's a recommendation, it's not binding, important guidelines also in relation to the labor rights and in particular social protection of informal economy workers. Nowadays, of course, the language of the ILO is very much in this line. The latest one is ILO Convention 190 of 2019 concerning the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. And that convention has been made applicable specifically to both workers in the formal and in the informal economy. Wonderful. Maybe I should have said this should have happened long ago. Nevertheless, then interestingly, if you were to look at this recommendation 204, the appreciation of the fact that when we deal with the informal economy, you have to look at specialized arrangements. For example, how do they could and should these people in the informal economy contribute? You have to be flexible, even in fast consultation concern. It's the first time ever that I know of that in an ILO instrument, the ILO has moved away from the strict approach that only trade unions can and should be consulted for purposes of representing workers. Of course, there's a realization that many informal economy workers do not have trade unions representing them. So some scope, limited scope, but some scope has been provided in that recommendation for consultations with representative organizations of these workers themselves, beyond trade unions. And then, of course, the ILO has rendered a lot of very good technical advice, not just in Africa, but in Asia and Latin America on extending protection to workers in the informal economy, and a lot of very good documentary evidence. We don't have time to discuss this. Briefly, the last category, labor migrants. bearing in mind what is the context in Africa, the weak protection, we discussed this yesterday in the Congress, of these workers in countries of destination, even African countries of destination, the limited but slowly, gradually increasing rate of ratification of ILO instruments in this area of labor migration. It's a paltry ratification record, to be honest, and limited bilateral labor agreements with wholly insufficient provisions, I must say. If you, I'll come back to the moment, and even social security agreements, as I said yesterday, largely lacking in the continent. So we see weak protection through these bilateral agreements. And something needs to be done. There's just recently been done a study under the auspices of the ILO, but for the Africa Union Commission, on the Africa Union on an evaluation, so to say, of what's happening, and with a set of guidelines to deal with this as far as bilateral labor agreements are concerned. Now, as far as collaboration with the Africa Union and the RECs are concerned in the region, we have seen very interesting, and some of them extremely, very recent developments. Just look at this. There's, as we speak, validated and yet to be approved still next month, last week of next month, the Africa Union Declaration of Migrant Workers' Rights, also a set of BLA guidelines for a model bilateral labor agreement. Also, the migrant welfare program, the issue that we discussed on Sunday, those who participated in that event. I'm reminded that we have to stop shortly. So let me just then go to the my conclusions. To say, yes, we have seen a positive impact on political and system changes. I also dealt with South Africa due to time constraints. We've seen the positive effect of international pressure and the ILO being part of that regime. But yet we have to say finally that there are still shortcomings. And with reference to these two categories, and I'm talking now shortcomings to which I think the ILO could play a major role. Labor rights, labor protection in the continent, in particular at the continental and RECs level. For some other reason, unlike social protection, we see much less activity there in that area. It's not the fault of the ILO. That's probably the reason for this lies with the continental and regional frameworks of the continent. Issues of representation, how to foster, support representation of informal economy workers. And this idea of transition to formality, I mean, that is the basis of recommendation 205. Still, the title of this recommendation says transition from the, from the informal to an informal economy. And there are many in the country would say, really? Is this realistic? Can we expect this at least even in the medium term? Big question mark. And finally, on labor migrants, labor rights protection as opposed to social protection. Again, here is also a problem. There's currently no international normative framework to help guide countries of origin. And that prompted the Africa Union countries very recently, 3-4 weeks ago, to validate an instrument, if I could use an instrument, a set of guidelines applicable to the Africa Union countries to help countries of origin that would want and would have to extend migrant welfare support to their own migrant workers abroad. There is no normative guidelines at international level, a huge deficiency in my view. And then the insufficient provisions in the BLAs and little BSA engagement. I know the ILO is doing a lot of good work to help countries, but we should even do more. Unless we really address this, our workers will remain extremely exposed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Marius. And colleagues, let me apologize to all of you for pushing you in terms of time. I think, as I'd been hoping, we probably have, I don't know the director, we do have a few minutes to comment and ask questions, obviously be brief and to the point. And I suggest that we probably should take a few questions before allowing the panelists to respond, please. The floor is open. Yes, Johan.
I want to, first of all, just thank the speakers for very informative, very useful presentations. I just, in a sense, have a practical question. I've been very concerned about informal sector and that it's an enormously important source of job creation. But one of the key features of the informal sector is that they stay below the radar. And what I mean by that is they do not let the state know that they're in operation, because then there's regulations they must meet and there's tax they've got to pay. So they stay, in a sense, invisible, below the radar. Now, how do you extend social rights and social benefits to people who deliberately avoid being observed and seen by the state? That's just my question.
Thank you, Johan. Any more comments or questions, please, before we allow the panelists to respond? I know they have been clear, but they have been raised some interesting issues. In fact, even some controversial issues. Can we, any? Yeah, okay, that's, but there's one there. In addition to that, as Freak has suggested, that you can put questions across online.
All right, now we have a question online from Itumeleng Motlatlegi.
There's one coming. Thank you. You go ahead, please.
Thanks, Prof. Having heard what you are presenting, how much informal will then be the violation of rights of those workers under the circumstances as you propose? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. One of the panelists didn't quite get your question. Can you repeat it, please?
Maybe just take the mask off first, then thank you.
How much informal should the violation of rights of those who will be expected to exercise their fundamental rights with respect to their employer? Thank you.
Thank you. Is that clear, Mario? Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions apart from online? Are there any online questions?
Yeah, Mr. Motlatlegi, you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks to the panelists and the presentations. I'm just interested, the last presentation talked about, mentioned South Africa as one of the culprits in non-compliance on this freedom of association. And the previous speaker spoke also about the net leg. So the question is, now that in South Africa is freedom of association, it's a fundamental, it's a constitutional right. And to what extent would we pick up that we fall in that category, South Africa, of non-compliance? And if so, what would be the impediments to that compliance? Because one would just pick up the political discussion to be not a political discussion, more of a capitalist approach as abuse, especially in the informal sector, as one of the perpetrators of that right. So I was interested in the discussion at NetLeg, as was mentioned by the second speaker and this industry. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question. Please, any more questions, please, before we allow the panelists to respond? Okay, we can, I think once, if we have a bit more time, we can always come back. So there you have it. I think the questions were addressed to all of you. I think I had one to Christina Kaiser and the other one I think was to Marius, wasn't it? Could you please take turns? Christina, could you please start by responding to the
Yes,
question?
but I have to be frank because I really thought the questions were mainly addressed to Marius and to Kaiser. So I couldn't really see the question regarding my presentation. So I will maybe answer last if I see something I'm thinking of, so I apologize for that. I don't see anything in particular with regard to my presentation unless I think of something later, if you don't mind.
I wonder what we should do. Christina, are you saying the question was not clear or what?
No, I'm saying I thought the questions were mainly relevant to the presentations of both Marius and Kaiser. Particularly, they were talking about South Africa and less about the general principles developed by the ILERA. So I couldn't really see there the link, the how I would come in. So, but I can listen and see what think about a contribution during the answers, if that's all right with you.
Okay.
Because there are mainly, I can say that in the informal economy, I hear that's a huge challenge, absolutely. I can only say that this is, the principle of freedom association do apply to informal sector or informal economy workers, that we do have this recommendation that Marius mentioned, that I agree that civil society may be more appropriate in the continent to address freedom association issues, but I thought the questions were, if you mind, were more related to Marius and Kaiser, if that's all right with you.
Prof, if I may come in.
Okay, Marius, would you like to do the third question and then we'll go to Kaiser? Yeah, thank you.
No, I think Kaiser can also do the third question. I think it's very much also,
speak up a bit,
sorry,
Marius,
can you hear me
please.
now?
Yeah.
The question on OHS compliance, etc., I think is also a question that Kaiser can deal with. Let me just say about that, of course, if I understood the speaker correctly, the online speaker, I must say the questions didn't come clearly over to me, but nevertheless, the issue of OHS compliance, non-compliance, I mean, the ILO has been clear on this over the years that there are still are several respects in the OHS framework, occupational health and safety, where South Africa is not even fully compliant with the conventions it has ratified, and in particular, this is a major problem in the mining sector. I'm not going to say more. Maybe the Kaiser would really be in the best position to further express on that issue. The first question, if you're on the invisibility of the informal economy, I think the answer is, on the face of it, yes, but it doesn't have to be yes. We have seen some wonderful efforts, even in this continent, where countries made a huge effort. India is also a very good example, and Latin America, of trying to find out who are these informal economy workers, where are they? And you need a proper kind of mapping exercise, a characterization of the informal economy. And I must say, unfortunately, even in this country, with its very well endowed statistical framework, etc., nothing of that sort has been done. The censuses and the surveys, they just skim over this area. And I know this because recently there was a framework proposed, and I think at NETLAC level, my understanding is broad agreement for a specialized regime for social protection for workers in the informal economy in South Africa. And a study underlying that concluded that there's too little information to know exactly who are these people and what are their numbers even. So it can be done. The measures to bring them on board, if you try to at least formalize them in some extent, to some extent, especially as far as the tax system is concerned, there are countries that have been hugely successful in this. Very many countries use the carrot approach, say, extending certain benefits, even social protection benefits. In many Latin American countries, you have what they call the mono tax. So yes, you pay tax, but part of your tax is the social security contribution, and sometimes governments will then add to this contribution to say that if you come under the system and we know who you are, then we can make sure that social security is being extended to you. So let me just stop there. Unfortunately, the second question still, after the second attempt, I couldn't understand what that question is all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Marius. Kaiser, please, I think you had a question pointed directly to you. Please, would you come in, please? Kaiser, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I hope I'm audible enough. So I did struggle also with that. I think it was the last question that Marius had asked the speaker to repeat, but maybe I'll answer to the best of my ability what I understood. But let me just start with the issue of extending protection to the informal workers. It is. I think Johan is quite correct that this is a difficult one. In fact, the discussions that have been ongoing for quite a while now at the ILO level about formalizing the informal sector have got, I suppose, in fact, safe to say that when these discussions started happening, maybe they overestimated the reception that they would get from this sector, because there was an assumption, and a wrong one at that it is what the people who are operating in informal sectors wanted, right? And that they were just waiting for the opportunity to formalize. But the reality is actually quite different, that there are some benefits to not formalizing. And I suppose it is a balancing act. It's about realizing that there are those people who are quite happy to operate in that space and would not want to lift their head, because then they will have to start paying taxes and all sorts of other things. Now, in the case of South Africa, for example, I'll just make reference again to the issue of the UIF in the context of COVID. So a lot of money was paid out to the workers who were unable to work during COVID, during the lockdown period. And there was a question about what about those people who were prevented from doing their small businesses in the informal sector in the streets and all that, because they could also not be out there, but they're not contributors to any social protection funds. And so what do we do with those people? So discussions have already started happening at NEDLEC on ways of extending protection to those people who are traditionally not in your standardized forms of work. And there's a number of them. Some are not in informal economy as such. Some are just, because of the way our laws are structured, prevented from contributing, like people who earn commission. There's a number of them, right? And so NEDLEC is, there are proposals that are being considered by both workers and business to see if we can maybe reshape the fund and the rules that govern the funds to bring in, to extend the net, as it were, to people, to, in other words, have more contributors, including from those who are not your traditional contributors. So it is going to be one of those carrot cases, I suppose, showed what the benefits would be for people to contribute, because in events like this, then they will be able to have some safety net. It's not going to be easy, as we have seen from international experience elsewhere, but it is something that we are currently undertaking, at least at the level of NEDLEC. There was a question also about South Africa having been a previous a case at the ILO for non-compliance with freedom of association, and what are the implications for any future infractions, especially now that we have NEDLEC. Look, I must say, back then, when before the constitution that we have now, South Africa was a different country, and I mean, it was a perfect candidate for a report of non-compliance. But since South Africa's readmission to the ILO and our series of laws that have been passed that have guaranteed the rights of workers and the freedom of association and the convention, I think we have seen a dramatic drop in complaints. I'm not saying that there aren't any. In fact, in recent history, I can only think of one case which did not even get that far because it was resolved quickly. And it was a case, I think it was involving PRASA. There was some agreement or provision that they had with some unions that they would only allow one union to represent workers, and that so some minority unions saw that as, and rightly so, as an infraction of their right to organize, and so that was taken to the ILO, and I'm happy to say that there was a resolution with government and the unions concerned, and so it did not progress very far. But it is possible that it can still happen. And just think of, for example, especially now with in the case of NEDLEC, as I think the question was based on that premise. NEDLEC is formed by there are certain associations, trade union associations that were there from the beginning, that were founding members, and there are criteria to admit new members. So there are trade unions that are not inside NEDLEC. I'm not saying that by being outside NEDLEC, that necessarily means their rights to freedom of association are compromised. No. But it is possible that those unions may find that in some cases they are a bit out in the cold as some policy decisions get taken at NEDLEC. And that could very well find expression in complaints to the ILO. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm happy to report that right now, South Africa isn't one of those countries that is a regular offender, in this respect. And there are countries that are regular offenders. And we are a constitutional state. Our laws are quite robust. Our courts are also quite active in this, in protecting the constitutional rights of all workers. So I think we, without saying that it can never happen, I could say that we are relatively safe compared to, I suppose, other jurisdictions. So, Prof, the question about the last one, I think it's OHS compliance for it. I don't know if it was OHS compliance in the informal economy. That wasn't very clear to me.
Yeah. I think to Kaiser, Marius, I think addressed it, canvassed it to a certain extent. Thank you very much. Thank you, I appreciate it. There you have it, colleagues. At the risk of putting words into the mouths of the panelists, my sense is that three kind of pieces of wisdom have emerged from this. The first, I think that Christina dealt with, was that the importance of the fundamental principles of international labor standards in spite of the COVID, recognizing the impact that the COVID is having, but in spite of that, the fundamental nature of those principles as the living principles, so to speak. The second one that I think Kaiser stressed is that if you look at the case of South Africa, despite the challenges that we together with the rest of the world are facing, social dialogue in the context, despite the COVID, is well and alive. Of course, limited, naturally, in terms of what the impact, the side effects, the adverse effects of that. But the story of South Africa is that social dialogue, which incidentally, I think one has got to stress, is a form of freedom of association, because freedom of association is a reflection of social dialogue. And Kaiser, I think, more or less asserted, and I think we correctly, that in spite of that, social dialogue is alive and well in spite of COVID. And the last one, I think that Marius, among other things, spoke to, was that freedom of association is alive and well in Africa, but there is need both for compliance, but also even much more importantly, for extension to take into account not only the informal sector, but the migrant labor as well. I mean, that is easier said than done. And in fact, Kaiser referred to the challenge of formalizing. Even the wisdom, what some have questioned is that do they really want to be informalized, to be brought into the, the formal sector? People have questioned that, but beyond that, is it feasible, seriously, to contemplate that even if the people in the informal economy were willing to be formalized, is it possible given the scale of informality that we have? Not only in South Africa, South Africa, I think, is the most formalized economy, 40% declining. In some areas, the informal sector is up to 97% in Africa. Is that a realistic goal in terms of wanting to formalize? So, but in spite of all that, the message is freedom of association is not simply a principle that underpins social dialogue, but wherever there is social dialogue, it ought to be part of that. But even much more importantly, and in fact, the current chief of the Freedom of Association branch, Karen Curtis, has emphasized that freedom of association is a sine qua non for democracy. It is an indication of how societies, how democratic societies are. So there you have it, colleagues and friends. Thank you very much again to the panelists. We really appreciate your wisdom, because it is your wisdom that you, I think, you shared with us. And so I think this is the end of this word. Let's please show our appreciation to the panelists once again. Thank you. Thank you very much. Frick, over to you, please. It's over to Marius, who is the, as you know, the chair of the scientific committee, and sort of is going to give some closing remarks. Yeah.
Thank you. Ladies and colleagues, I don't think I'm actually the one giving the closing remarks. My only task here is to serve as a chair for this very last session of the Congress, which is a closing session. And yeah, to some extent, an opportune moment for the two who will be speaking here now to bring everything together in terms of, what has happened and all of those who were involved. We are changing the order of the closing ceremony, and in fact, I'm going to invite in the first place Frikkie de Bruin. Mr. Bruin does not need any introduction. We all know him not just from this Congress, but otherwise. He's the General Secretary of probably the hottest seat in the country, being of the PCDC, the largest cohort of workers in the country, and helping to try and maintain a labor peace as far as possible, make sure that negotiations are on track, and lately also been fairly, that it could have been so much more disastrous. Frikkie is also, as we know, was until recently an EXCO member of ILERA EXCO committee. He's the president of LERASA. He's also the person chairing the local organizing committee for this Congress, as was the case the previous one as well, the African one, and also the 2015 World Congress. So Frikkie, we are going to ask you to do a vote of thanks. So let's ask Frikkie to come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsulu. Thank you, Marius, for the introduction. Yes, Evans and Marius is correct. We've come to the last half hour of this Congress. Then it's back to solitary confinement for you at home. So yeah, I understand that you are still all sitting here. Nobody wants to leave, and that's a good sign. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me just for a few minutes, because this part of the Congress is as important as the opening part was, or any other part in this process in itself. My first role would be to do a vote of thanks, and then also to deal with some special announcements as well. While I feel my pocket, if you're driving a car from KwaZulu-Natal and your car is in the parking lot and you think you have your key, you don't. I have it. So you'll have to come to me and you'll have to tell me the opener that you open the beers with, from which company is it? Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to give you the keys. So I can't trust anybody to just come and take the key from me, but I'm sure that you would know it. If it's your car and you've got something that opens a beer bottle, I'm not sure why you would be driving with an opener for a beer bottle, but nonetheless, you'll have to come and disclose to me that it's yours. People, it allows me or allow me to do a vote of thanks for this Congress. These type of Congresses don't just come together. We have a team of people that assist and that work in these processes. We have had a Congress, and we call this Congress the Congress of Innovation. You won't know how much we innovated on Monday. Things totally went haywire, and we had to continuously innovate and bring processes to some logic process in itself. And there's a whole team behind there that did that. But allow me to start by thanking our sponsor, ILERA, the International Labour and Employment Relations Association, and especially their president, Professor Harry Katz, and also our African Exco member, Ms. Shalane Udet, for facilitating the sponsorship. We really appreciate that. Our contributors, and if I say contributors, I specifically want to thank again the Public Service Bargaining Councils, ensuring your presence in this Congress, the SSBC, Homotso, Public Health and Social Development, Mpumi, GPSSBC, Shalane. Thank you for always supporting Rasa and making these type of events possible for us. Then the Scientific Committee, under the leadership of Professor Marius Olivier, for reviewing and putting the program together. It's a process, people, that unfolds over months. It's not something that just happens in a week or two, and it takes a lot of commitment from people that does this without reward or anything else in terms of process. So we want to thank the Scientific Committee for their work. With Marius is Professor Johan Maria, Ms. Nigay Kanyongola from Malawi, Professor Tiu Tukuru from Botswana, Shalane Udet, as well as Professor Evans Kalula. Thank you all for the work that you've done in making sure that we have a program of good quality and of high standard that was presented during the week. To the members of the study groups, those of you that followed the program on Sunday, we had 3 study groups that took place. And if you haven't followed it, you can go back and look at the recordings, and you can pick up on the recordings of those study group events. But those study groups under the chairpersonship of Tanya Venter, Edwin Riga, and Maria Monsalves, thank you very much for your participation, as well as those that attended the study group. And we want to invite you to join these study groups. You always ask what happens between congresses. We come from one congress to another congress. What happens in between? And the ideal opportunity would be for you to be involved in these study groups. There are various study groups on various fields, migration, dispute resolution, anything is there. And you can be part of those sessions, and those people meet on a regular basis, and they have discussions and they have debates. If you don't know how to get hold of them, please make contact with us, and we will make sure that you are linked to one of those study groups to participate as well. Then to the 70-odd speakers from the 10 African countries, speakers from Greece, India, Denmark, Canada, South Korea, and the countries in the Latin America subcontinent. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for making your work available and to share it with us in the session. They always say the quality of papers or the presented at a Congress measures the success of an event or measures the success of a Congress. And based on what you have done and what you have presented over these last few days, I'm sure we can declare this Congress as a huge success. And I would like you to give a round of applause to all of those speakers that have participated over this days. Thank you very much. Then to the staff of Sand Parks, here at the venue, as well as at the hotel. Thank you very much. You ensure that we remain comfortable and that you look after us. And we really appreciate that, and we really appreciate the work that you do as well. Then I said it's a Congress of Innovation, and that is exactly what this was in terms of process. There was a team that was behind this process, and a team of support staff that has been working very hard to make sure that everything links and everything comes together. The Shamira, Umang, Wandile, Dinyiko, Solo, Tseke, and Shana, and Hendrik on the AV. Thank you very much. You've done a great job, and we are very proud to have had you part of this process over the last year, putting everything together and bringing it to this concluding session. And I also think they deserve a round of applause for their work. And then lastly, I think to all 127 physical attendees that were here every day attending the session, and the 140 virtual participants that came in and out of the sessions as well. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for your engagement and your interaction during this week. Without you here present at the session, we wouldn't have had a Congress and it wouldn't have been successful. So also to yourself, you might give yourself a round of applause and thank yourself for that. I'm not going to mention gender, I'm just going to applaud. Because the applaud on gender was much louder than the applaud here, but nonetheless. All right. And that leaves me, that ends the vote of thanks, and that leaves the process of thanking people for their participation and for being here. There's one event or one process that's still outstanding, which I am very privileged to be able to talk to and to present to you. It's not on the program. It's not part of what is listed there because we didn't want it to be known. We wanted to be something that we announce just as a show of appreciation and thanks. ILERA is an institution of labor and employment practitioners as well as academics that comes together in South Africa. And we have this type of engagements and congresses, and we have this type of interactions where we engage and where we interact. ILERA is an institution that started many years ago under the name IRASA, when it was still industrial relations, before we changed the term to become labor and employment relations. So it's an institution that has been there for quite a number of years. The constitution of ILERA also allows us to do lifetime honorary acknowledgements and to acknowledge people for the contribution that they've done towards the organization, and then to also award a lifetime award to such an individual and such a person. It is my privilege to announce that today we're doing our first honorary lifetime award. And it's a privilege for us to do it while the person is still here and that we can still have the opportunity to recognize the work that the person has done for the organization and the contribution that he has done for the work or for the field of specialty of labor and employment relations. And when you've been having your first job in 1974, when I was still very young, very, very young, then you must understand that you will have a CV of about 25 pages. And then when I try to summarize that CV and I try to bring it and just to try and highlight and pick out highlights, and I still end up with 7 pages of highlights. You must understand that it was a lifetime achievement, an achievement of various events. Allow me to just quickly breeze through this and just in recognition of the individual, just to mention to you some of the various achievements that this person has achieved over the years. First of all, this person holds an educational and professional background. He holds a PhD from the School of Law and the University of Warwick in 1989. He has a MLit status from the Ballard College, University of Oxford in 1978, a LLM from the King's College, University of London in 1976, and an LLB with merit from the School of Law and University of Zambia in 1974. The person also concluded various certificate courses, amongst other the International Law course from the Hague Academy, 1976, the Human Rights course presented in Strasbourg in 1977, and the Humanitarian Law course presented in San Remo in 1983. This person is an academic, he's a researcher, he's a person that holds professional affiliation with research organizations and standing, like the National Research Foundation, as a B-rated researcher, a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa, a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences, and a fellow of the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies. He holds professional affiliations and accreditations, and I'm really going to be summative in terms of them because there are various ones that is holding. But he was an arbitrator and a mediator in the then IMASA or IMSA that was established in 1994 up to 2000. Arbitrator and a mediator in the services of the South African panel in 2001. He was a member of the executive committee, a president and a past president of the International Labour and Employment Relations Association. He is an honorary life member of the African Labour Law Society, a life member of the International Education Association of South Africa, and also a member and past president of the Society of Law Teachers of Southern Africa. That was page 1. Page 2, various research and teaching interests. This person also has interest in international comparative labor law, labor market regulation and labor legislation, social protection and social security, law and regional integration, as well as issues around jurisdictions of the South African Development Community, SADC. Scholarships, fellowships and awards. People, he holds various of these, amongst those Human Rights Fellowship and Internship as an international labor officer with the ILO, with the University of Zambia. He's got a special fellowship there as well. The Rhodes Scholarship with the Rhodesia and Zambian Ballard College in Oxford. Work experiences over and above everything else that he's done. He was with the University of Cape Town, started his career in 1992 as a senior research officer in the labor law unit in the Faculty of Law, and he ended his career as the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Law in the international and outreach processes from 2009 to 2011. He was also the chairperson of the South African Employment Conditions Commission and a member of the South African Employment Conditions Commission from 1998 to 2011. He also interacted through the countries, through SADC countries, and he has interacted in various countries on various areas, like a senior lecturer at the National University of Lesotho, a lecturer of law at the National University of Lesotho, Human Rights Fellow, International Labour Officer in Geneva, has also then started as a trainee state advocate at the Attorney General's Chambers in Lusaka in 1974. Okay. Part-time teaching appointments, and held various of those at various institutions and at various processes. He also has selected external university work, and he was an examiner for various universities for students of LLB, LLM, and PhD. Amongst those universities, the Andy University in India, the School of Law, Brunel University in the United Kingdom, as well as the School of Law in the University of Dar es Salaam. He has issued various and written various editorial works, and he has commissioned work in terms of printing. And people, again, I'm saying to you that this is extremely summarized, and this should not try to to give all of the credit to the individual that he's done over the years, but he's commissioned various titles with the Juta publications since 2020. He was on the editorial board of the Human Science Research Council from 2019 to date, Institute for Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa from 2016 to date, amongst those. He has also done selected forwards to various publications by various authors. He has held external positions in terms of work, in terms of processes in itself. He has also published various articles, chapters in books, books in itself, monographs, and his edited works. And he has worked with many accredited academics, even in the room, Professor Olivier, Professor Maria. He's worked with them in terms of publications. He did various selected conference papers and presentations and proceedings, applied legal and policy research work. He was the lead organizer of the 17th World Congress of ILERA in Cape Town in September 2015. And he also dealt with the labor law reform in Zambia in 2012. Contributes to labor reform in Zanzibar. He also runs a special SADC project on social security, and he also serves on various selected research grants and other organizations in other processes. Even pre-1994, he published various books and various publications, and we will, for purposes of completeness, publish his full CV on the ILERA website as well for you to have a look at. And he also holds various teaching and supervision provisions even before 1994 within various countries and within various processes. The individual is born, I want to say South African, but I can't. He is born Zambian, but he's a full resident of South Africa. He currently is the chairperson of the ILO Committee on Freedom of Association. He's the Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Cape Town. He's an honorary professor at the University of Rwanda, and is the executive policy advisor for the University of Lusaka. We are privileged to award this lifetime honorary membership, and we are specifically privileged to have his wife here, and that was really by default, having here as well, and also giving recognition to her in herself, also an academic of recognition, to Professor Evans Rabban Kalula. Thank you very much, Evans. Sebastian, please join us. Thank you.
Colleagues and friends, this is just amazing. I smell a conspiracy that has led to this. First of all, I'm most grateful to the Lord for having extended my tenancy as a living being on this planet. As some of you know, 8 years ago, more than 8 years ago, I was dying. I had heart failure. Inevitably, it came to a head on the 12th of December. I collapsed and found myself, under a machine to help my heart continue beating. And the Lord, in His grace, found me a donor. I don't know the details of that donor. They don't give you. All we know is that she was a woman from Port Elizabeth. And then 7 hours later, on the 19th of December 2012, I had a new heart. Other than that, so I will always regard myself as Zambian because that is where my initial kind of burst of life started. But I'm South African. At least I've got your heart, and I've got your heart, and thankful and fortunate to have that. I count my blessings. That as part, I have been blessed to have an incredible woman by my side who literally has made my life what it is, helped me survive. She's not only my personal physician, but she's also now, I've come to rely on her as my personal IT specialist because I am one of those unreconstructed BBC born before computers. So she's, and the great thing about you women, and I count myself in that lot, sorry boys, is that you can multitask. You can multitask. And she's incredible. I love this woman. And I think she's more than she knows. So that's my story. But my story is not that. My story extends, first of all, to Manfred Weiss, who I met way back in Zambia. And I always said of Manfred Weiss and the late Professor Sir Bob Heppel as the best supervisors I never had, but was lucky, fortunate to have as mentors. That said, all this would not have been possible without the support of a number of people. Some of them are in this room. First of all, Marius Orifi, who I've known and worked with. In fact, I regard myself as a disciple of Marius Orifi. The man is, the inspiration is catching in terms of, this is the hardest work, working academic I know. It's amazing what Marius does in terms of his commitment to his country and to the rest of Africa. He and I are kindred spirits. I think he's a foreign Dutch Reformed boy, but I'm still very much Dutch Reformed. And I'm a missionary boy, by the way. It's what he, in spite of the terrible, terrible, terrible things that the church here were in upholding the apartheid there, they did some very excellent work through their missionary wing. A lot of people in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi would not have gone anywhere in terms of their development without the presence of the Dutch Reformed Church. And for me, I'm a lifelong member of that, in spite of whatever direction they take. And Marius Orifi and I share those roots. And as I keep saying, I'm not sure whether it's an upstanding member of the church. By the way, I'm married to a Catholic. And the Catholics, when you marry, they require that your children should be brought up as Catholics, which I reluctantly agreed. Whether they are good Catholics or not, you can ask Sebastiana. But all I can say for myself is that I am an upright kind of, Dutch Reformed missionary boy. And then, of course, there is Frick and Johan. Frick, along with his colleagues, Sharon Fowan, and the Frick is not only the Lhasa, but he has, he emphasizes, Frick is amazing. He, through the former IRASA, and Johan was part of that. And IRASA now has virtually kept our association with ILERA alive. South Africa now proudly can regard itself as the most committed member of ILERA. And that has been due to Frick's efforts. First of all, in sort of persuading the PSBC to render support to his efforts. And you can see this is the outcome of the efforts of the PSBC. So I salute them, but not only that, I think my best dubious 15 minutes of fame were in 2015, and Frick and Marius, Johan and others were responsible for that. I wasn't really up to it. In fact, we started off in the planning stages in 2012, the year I was on my way out. And they bravely said they were going to host the World Congress for the first time in Africa. A lot of skepticism in the ranks. And this is why I keep constantly emphasizing that what ILERA, the best ILERA has to offer is the recognition of universality, that Africa is not going anywhere, we are part of it. And Frick has ensured that we are part of it. We have successful and yes. These colleagues have been incredible. And their faith, their efforts, their commitment to South Africa and the rest of the continent is just, incredible, as I keep saying. This award is a proxy. I'm just a proxy for these people's efforts. And thank you very much, Rerasa, for this recognition. I'll always treasure it. And, in Asia, there's a saying that if you save a man's life once, you are responsible for them for the rest of your life. And so I regard myself as South Africa being responsible for the rest of my life. You saved my life, and the least I can do is give back whatever little I can, not only to South Africa, but to the rest of Africa and the world. So thank you very much, Frick. I really appreciate it. I don't know, you've made my year, quite frankly. Thank you.
Well, Evans, I don't think you are done, because you now have to give the closing remarks for the Congress, if you have anything to add. But really, from all of us, what has just happened is a small recognition of, if we could say this in humanly terms, of a great man with great achievements, yet still being one of the most humble people I know on planet Earth. Evans, any closing remarks? Or are you through? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have come to an end of, really, if I could say this, in my view, not just a very successful, but very instructive Congress. I've learned so much from all of you, especially those of you who spoke. contributed, but all the others as well, the way in which people have interacted with each other, our social connection with each other as well. The wonderful work that has gone on behind the scenes. Frikkie mentioned his team, and I want to reiterate again, this is a team that they've come now through a few of these congresses, regional ones and the world, you know, the three-yearly World Congress. And he mentioned them, and many of them are here. Whatever they were, you wouldn't want to stand up. People like Shamira and Shana, where's Omang, Mandile, and can the team just stand up that we give them another round of applause and thanks. Omang, please stand up. Frikkie, you too. Also Frikkie. Yeah, of course. Where's our protocol officer? Well, you're part of the team, but you said there as if you are not. So to him as well, and you as well, and sir, helped us so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe lunch is waiting. This will be a joyful lunch, so to say, not because we have come at the end of this session, but that we are not overly exhausted. Of course, it's half a day, but what a privilege to have this lunch also then with Evans, to whom rightfully this award was given personally, but also on behalf of the Scientific Committee and on behalf of the local organizing committee. We want to thank you sincerely and deeply for your involvement, your participation. As I said at the beginning, the first day, you make the Congress as you have been making. I wish you a safe journey back today or tomorrow, wherever you are traveling. Some of you may be staying a few more days. Yeah, driving is even more dangerous in any country, particularly this country, in comparison with flying. So just be careful. Great, thank you so much. Wish you the very best. Okay.